had always loved the outdoors. There was something peaceful about being in nature, away from the noise of the city, with nothing but trees and fresh air surrounding me. So, when my friends suggested we go camping for the weekend, I didn't hesitate to agree. It seemed like the perfect escape. We arrived at the campsite in the early afternoon. The sun was high, and the woods around us were still filled with the vibrant sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the breeze. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and planned to cook dinner as the sun dipped behind the treeline. It was a small campsite, not very well known, but it had a certain charm. It wasn't too far from civilization, yet it felt completely isolated. There were no other campers nearby, which suited us just fine. I liked the feeling of being alone, though I knew we weren't completely cut off from the world. The closest town was only about an hour's drive away, and our phones still had some signal, though it wasn't great. As the evening wore on, the fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the air. We made jokes and told stories, laughing about silly things that didn't matter. I felt content, safe. There was nothing to worry about. At least that's what I thought. The first strange thing happened just after we finished eating. It was about 9 p.m., and the sky had fully darkened. We were sitting around the fire when suddenly, the air seemed to grow still. The crickets had stopped chirping, and even the wind had died down. The silence felt oppressive, almost as if something was watching us. I brushed it off as nothing more than my imagination, but it was hard to ignore the eerie stillness that had settled around us. Then I heard it, a rustling sound coming from the woods. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal moving through the underbrush, but the sound was too deliberate, too close to the camp. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice low, almost a whisper. The others were quiet for a moment, and I could see the same unease in their faces. One of them, Mark, stood up and grabbed a flashlight from his bag. He pointed it into the trees, scanning the dark, but there was nothing, just shadows stretching between the trunks of the tall pines. "Probably just an animal," Mark said, sitting back down. His voice sounded a little forced, like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it only grew stronger as the night went on. The sound didn't return, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. I couldn't explain it. There was no logical reason for it. Everything seemed fine on the surface, but I was on edge. As the fire began to die down, we all decided to turn in for the night. The temperature had dropped, and the woods around us seemed even darker, the air colder. I zipped myself into my tent and tried to push the strange feeling from my mind. I reminded myself that it was just a campsite, just a weekend getaway. Nothing to worry about. I must have fallen asleep eventually, but I woke up in the middle of the night. My watch said it was 2:47 a.m. I had no idea why I woke up. I hadn't heard anything, and I didn't feel particularly cold or uncomfortable. But my eyes were wide open, staring into the dark fabric of the tent. At first, I thought it was just a restless night, but then I noticed something. There was a low, almost imperceptible sound coming from outside. It wasn't the wind or animals. It sounded like footsteps, slow, careful, deliberate footsteps. I held my breath, listening hard. There was definitely something out there. I grabbed my flashlight and, without thinking, unzipped the tent just a little to peek outside. My heart pounded in my chest. The campfire was just a few glowing embers now, casting faint light over the campsite. But there was no sign of anyone or anything moving. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the footsteps had sounded so real. I had to know. Slowly, I crawled out of the tent, trying not to make any noise. I stood, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and scanned the dark edges of the campsite. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, A branch snapped somewhere deep in the woods behind our tents. I jumped. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I turned around quickly, shined my light toward the others' tents. They were all still closed, the shadows inside moving slightly as they shifted in their sleep. They were all completely unaware of the tension in the air. I had to remind myself that they weren't going to hear whatever I was hearing. The footsteps were soft, like someone was trying to stay hidden, but I couldn't ignore them. I was frozen in place for a moment, listening carefully. Then the sound came again, this time much closer. It was coming from the trees behind the campsite. I could hear the leaves rustling underfoot, the unmistakable sound of someone walking toward us. My stomach twisted into a knot. My first instinct was to run and wake the others, but something held me back. What if it was just an animal? Or worse, what if it wasn't? I stood in the dark, waiting for the next sound. It didn't come. The woods were completely silent now, as if whatever had been out there had just vanished. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and my breath caught in my throat. There was no way I was going back to sleep. I decided to stay up, watch, and wait. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My flashlight was my only source of light, and the beam seemed to shrink the farther I shined it into the trees. I kept hearing little noises, branches cracking, leaves moving, but nothing I could pinpoint. The night seemed endless, and I was starting to question my own mind. Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. It wasn't a whisper, but it wasn't loud either. It was distant, muffled, like someone was speaking through a heavy fog. It wasn't a language I recognized, and it didn't sound like anyone from our group. My heart started pounding in my chest. There was no one else out here. No one had passed by earlier, no other campers, no rangers. Just us. I swung the flashlight around again, my hands shaking, and finally, there it was, a figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall, hunched slightly, and I could just make out its silhouette. It didn't move at first, but I could feel it watching me. My pulse was deafening in my ears. I had no idea who or what it was, but every cell in my body screamed for me to run. I couldn't. I was paralyzed. The figure didn't stay long. It vanished back into the woods, moving so quietly that it seemed to melt into the shadows. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where it had been. Eventually, I snapped out of it. I ran back to my tent, scrambled inside, and zipped it shut. I don't know how long I lay there, trembling, before I finally heard the soft snores of my friends outside. The feeling of terror that had gripped me began to fade, but only slightly. I still couldn't shake the image of the figure standing in the dark. I didn't want to alarm anyone, so I stayed quiet. I kept my thoughts to myself, hoping that maybe it had just been a bad dream, that I was overthinking things. But the next morning, when the sun came up, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to tell my friends. They didn't believe me at first, thinking I was just spooked by the dark. But when I mentioned the footsteps and the strange noises, they all grew quiet. Mark, the one who had been most confident about everything being fine the night before, looked at me with concern in his eyes. "You really think someone was out there?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice shaky. "But I heard something, and I saw someone, or something." We packed up our things quickly, ready to leave, even though we'd only planned to stay one more night. I don't think anyone felt comfortable in the woods anymore. As we loaded up the car, I took one last look at the campsite. The trees loomed tall and silent, and for a moment, it felt like something was still watching from the shadows. But then the breeze kicked up, and the world felt normal again. We left without any more incidents, but to this day, I still wonder what I saw that night. I don't know if it was a person, an animal, or something else entirely, but I've never gone back to that campsite, and I never will. Some things are better left alone. I've always liked camping. There's something about the quiet of the woods that makes everything else fade away. The hum of the world, the noise, the constant rush. It all disappears when you're out there, just you and nature. That's why I didn't think twice when my friend suggested a weekend in a remote spot in the forest, somewhere nobody else went. We'd been camping before, nothing too fancy, just tents and a campfire, but this time was different. This time we were going deep into the woods. The plan was simple: grab our gear, make the long drive, hike in, set up camp, and enjoy the weekend. No phone service, no distractions, just time to unwind. But what we didn't plan for was what happened when we set up camp. We'd chosen a spot beside a small creek that ran through a cluster of pine trees. The sound of the water was soothing as we set up our tents, unpacked our gear, and started a fire. The evening air was crisp, and the sky was clear, just a few stars peeking out above the tree line. I remember thinking that it was the perfect night, peaceful, beautiful, and far from the chaos of the world. Little did I know, things were about to take a turn. As the sun set, we sat around the fire, talking and laughing. The warmth of the flames was comforting against the chill of the evening, and we felt safe, surrounded by the tall trees. But as the night wore on, I started to feel uneasy, not scared, but something was off. It was subtle at first. I couldn't put my finger on it. A rustle in the trees, the way the wind felt too still for so long, the way the shadows seemed a little too thick. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision, a flicker of movement, but when I turned to look, there was nothing. The air seemed to grow colder as the night deepened, and by the time we'd eaten our meals and started winding down for bed, I felt the first stirrings of discomfort. I was used to camping out, used to the noises of the forest, but there was something strange about tonight. The usual nighttime chorus of insects and critters was quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional pop of a log. We sat in silence for a while, each of us lost in our thoughts, the fire casting long, dancing shadows. That's when I heard it. A faint noise, barely audible, just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe an animal moving through the brush. But then it came again, clearer this time. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I glanced at my friend. He hadn't noticed. His eyes were fixed on the fire, his face illuminated by the orange glow. I stared back at the dark edges of the woods, straining my ears, but the sound was gone. For a few moments, I convinced myself I'd imagined it, but the nagging feeling of unease lingered. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice quiet, unsure. "Hear what?" he asked, looking up from the fire. "Just, I don't know, something out there," I said, not wanting to sound crazy. He shrugged. "Probably just a deer or something. It's the woods, man." I nodded, but the feeling didn't go away. I kept my eyes fixed on the trees, half expecting something to emerge from the darkness. The silence felt too heavy now, too unnatural. It wasn't long before we decided to call it a night and crawl into our tents. I tried to shake off the strange feeling as I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, but I couldn't. The sounds of the forest had faded completely, replaced by an almost suffocating stillness. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing and the faint rush of the creek nearby. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept tossing and turning, wondering if I should check outside or if I was just overthinking it. The night stretched on, each minute feeling longer than the last. At some point, I must have drifted off, but my sleep was restless, filled with vague, uneasy dreams. The next morning, everything seemed fine. The sun was up, birds were singing, and the forest looked as beautiful as ever. We got up, stretched, and made breakfast over the campfire. But there was something in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. We spent the day hiking through the woods, exploring the surrounding area, but the feeling of being watched never quite left me. I kept seeing movement out of the corner of my eye, quick flashes of something darting between the trees. It was always just out of reach, but it left me with a growing sense of dread. That evening, as we sat around the fire again, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was like there was something out there, something just beyond the firelight, waiting. The more I thought about it, the more real it became, until I was certain we weren't the only ones in the woods. I finally said something about it again, trying to ignore how ridiculous I felt. I think we're being watched." My friend laughed. "You've been watching too many horror movies, man. It's just your mind playing tricks." But I couldn't shake the feeling. I stayed quiet, keeping my gaze on the fire, but my mind was racing. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of the leaves seemed louder than before, and I couldn't help but wonder if something was out there, just waiting for the right moment. As the night wore on, the sounds returned, slow, deliberate crunching steps through the underbrush. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something was out there, and it was moving closer. My heart raced. I wasn't sure what to do. I thought about grabbing a flashlight, but I didn't want to reveal our position to whatever it was. I stayed still, hoping the thing, whatever it was, wouldn't notice us. The steps stopped. Dead silence. I held my breath, straining my ears. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the crunching resumed, but this time it was closer, much closer. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. Something was out there, and I wasn't sure what it wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. My friend was still sitting there, oblivious to the danger that I could feel closing in on us. His back was turned to the dark woods, but I couldn't keep my eyes off the shadows anymore. I got up, carefully, trying not to make a sound, and began moving toward my tent. My eyes never left the trees, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I slowly unzipped my tent and slipped inside, the silence pressing down on me. I didn't know what to do. We were too far from the nearest road to make a run for it. Our phones had no signal, and if we tried to leave in the dark, we might get lost. I thought about waking my friend, but I didn't want to panic him. Instead, I stayed in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest, wondering if the thing I felt was real, or if I was just imagining it. Then it happened. A sharp, high-pitched scream shattered the silence, coming from the direction of the trees. It was a scream I couldn't explain, a human scream, but something about it was wrong. It wasn't just fear. There was pain, desperation in it, but also something darker. The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by a series of low, guttural noises that I couldn't place. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as the noise continued, fading in and out like something, or someone, was moving through the trees, and it wasn't human. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and my pulse raced in my ears. I wasn't sure how much time passed, but eventually, the noises stopped. The woods were silent again. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in my tent, listening to every sound, terrified of what might happen next. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made those noises was still out there, just waiting for the right moment. The next morning, my friend woke up and seemed confused. He didn't hear the screams, didn't notice anything unusual. I didn't know what to say. Should I tell him? Should I leave and risk getting lost in the dark? Or should we stay? I didn't have the answer, but I knew one thing: whatever was out there, it wasn't just a trick of the mind. It was real, and it was waiting. We decided to leave. The trip was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway, but that night had changed everything. We packed up as quickly as we could, barely looking at each other, too afraid to speak. As we hiked back to the car, the forest felt different, unwelcoming, almost angry, as if it knew we were leaving. The sense of being watched never fully left, and I didn't feel safe until we hit the main road. I've camped many times since then, but I'll never forget that night. The woods felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. Whatever we heard, whatever was out there, it's still out there, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers. And if you're ever out in the woods, deep in the quiet, and you feel like someone's watching you, just know that sometimes you're not wrong. Sometimes there's something in the dark that shouldn't be there. The night was growing colder, and the fire crackled softly in front of me. I had always loved camping in the woods. The peace, the quiet, the sense of being far away from the hustle of everyday life. This time, I had decided to go solo. No friends, no family, just me and the wilderness. First, everything seemed perfect. I had arrived early, set up my tent, and gone for a long hike before the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest was thick with towering pines, and the ground was covered with soft pine needles. The air smelled fresh, almost clean. The only sounds were the occasional chirping of birds, the wind rustling through the trees, and the rhythmic crackling of my campfire. I felt a sense of calm as I sat there, roasting marshmallows and looking up at the stars. The sky was clear, and the stars seemed to stretch on forever. I had packed light, just enough food, some water, and my survival gear. There was no need for anything more. It was supposed to be a simple, peaceful weekend away from everything. But that night, something felt off. As the darkness deepened, the usual sounds of the forest began to change. The wind seemed to pick up, and the trees around me began to sway more violently than before. It wasn't anything too alarming at first, but I noticed the sound of rustling in the bushes near the edge of my campsite. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. It could just be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but I couldn't help but feel watched. The rustling continued for several minutes, and then it stopped. That silence was worse than the noise, and I found myself holding my breath, straining my ears to catch any sign of movement. The firelight flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the trees around me. I grabbed my flashlight, my fingers trembling slightly, and pointed it toward the noise. Nothing. The woods were still again. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood up, carefully keeping the fire between myself and the darkness around me. My flashlight swept across the trees, the ground, and the bushes, but I saw nothing. Maybe it had been an animal like I thought, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. I tried to get some sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard the rustling again. It was faint but persistent, and it seemed to be getting closer. Eventually, I gave up on sleep. I lay there, wide awake, staring at the ceiling of my tent, my thoughts racing. I decided to take a walk to clear my mind. The night air was colder now, and the forest was even darker, the trees looming over me like silent watchers. I stepped out of the tent, the crunch of pine needles underfoot the only sound. The fire had died down to embers, casting a dim glow around the campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the trail that led into the forest. My mind was a blur of thoughts, mostly fear, though I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I walked for a while, my footsteps muffled by the soft forest floor. The trees around me were so thick that the moonlight barely reached the ground. The silence was almost oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. My breath came in shallow gasps as I quickened my pace, my heart thumping in my chest. Something was wrong. I had no idea what, but I knew I wasn't safe here anymore. As I walked deeper into the woods, I came across an old, overgrown cabin. It was falling apart, half the roof caved in and the windows shattered. It looked abandoned, but I couldn't help the dread that surged through me. Who else would be out here at this hour? I stood there for a moment, staring at the cabin, my breath clouding in the cold night air. The rustling sound from earlier echoed in my mind. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. I took a step toward the cabin, and that's when I heard it again. A low, soft rustling, but this time it was closer. I turned quickly, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. It was just a raccoon, I told myself, but it was much too large, its eyes glowing in the beam of my light, watching me. The animal didn't move, just stared at me as if it were sizing me up. I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the flashlight. The rustling stopped. I knew something wasn't right. I could feel the forest around me closing in, the silence growing heavier. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I started to back away from the raccoon, slowly, not wanting to provoke it. But as I moved, I heard a new sound, a twig snapping behind me. I froze. The sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was out there. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to run, to get back to my camp as fast as I could. But my legs refused to move. The only thing I could do was stand there, paralyzed by fear, listening to the crunching of leaves behind me, growing louder and closer. The raccoon bolted, disappearing into the brush, but I didn't move, couldn't. The footsteps, if that's what they were, sounded deliberate, slow, like someone was carefully making their way toward me, watching me with every step. I couldn't take it anymore. My legs finally moved and I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, blindly, stumbling over rocks and branches, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, and every sound amplified my fear. I finally reached my campsite, gasping for air. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my hands shook as I grabbed my gear and threw it into the tent. My mind raced. Was I just paranoid? Or had I really heard someone out there? I didn't have an answer, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I packed everything up in a frenzy, feeling the eyes of the forest on me as I moved. I was ready to leave. I didn't care about the hike or the peaceful escape. It wasn't worth it anymore. I wasn't alone in those woods, and I wasn't going to risk finding out who or what was out there. With everything packed, I made my way back to the trailhead, not looking back once. I kept my flashlight on the path ahead, listening for any sounds in the woods behind me. There were no more footsteps, no more rustling, just the sound of my own breath and the pounding of my heart. I finally reached my car, breathless and drenched in sweat. I got in, locked the doors, and drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. The lights of civilization were a welcome sight. The feeling of being watched never left me, but the further I got from the woods, the less intense it became. I'll never forget that night, and I'll never go back into those woods. Whatever I heard out there, I don't know. But I know one thing for sure: I wasn't alone. And I'm okay with never finding out who or what was following me through the trees. I decided to go camping alone. No one else was free, and I needed some time away from the noise of daily life, so I packed my gear and headed into the woods. I wasn't one to scare easily, but deep down, something about being alone in the wilderness felt different. It wasn't the first time I'd camped solo, but something about this trip felt off. I brushed it off as nerves, a reaction to the isolation. I told myself, no big deal. The campsite I had chosen was far enough from the main trail that I wouldn't get many visitors. I liked it that way. The woods around me were thick, and the nearest road was miles away. It was perfect, quiet, serene, just what I needed. Setting up camp took a while, but I managed. I had a small tent, a fire pit, and a few provisions. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, I was ready to settle in for the night. The fire crackled in the pit, its warmth chasing away the evening chill, and I found myself staring at the flickering flames, listening to the wind rustling through the leaves. The forest was alive in its own way, and I felt at peace. As the sky grew darker, I couldn't help but feel like something was watching me. It wasn't a feeling I could describe fully, but it was like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the usual creepiness of the forest at night, but the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, crawling under my skin. I told myself to relax, to focus on the fire, and I began roasting a couple of marshmallows. The crackle of the fire and the occasional chirp of a distant bird were the only sounds. But then, there was something else. A subtle shift in the air. A silence that wasn't quite right. The kind of silence that made you stop in your tracks and listen harder. I froze, marshmallow in hand, and waited. There was nothing but the soft rustle of the leaves. I looked around, my eyes scanning the darkness just beyond the firelight. The woods were dense, and the shadows felt deeper than usual. My heart started to beat a little faster. Maybe it was nothing, just my nerves playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned my head slowly, trying to listen for any sound, any movement. My eyes focused on the area to the left of the campfire, just outside the reach of the light. For a second, I thought I saw something move quick, just a blur, a flash of something dark. It was gone before I could even process it. Maybe it was a deer or a shadow playing tricks, but why had it felt so sudden, so intentional? I stood up, walking toward the spot, my flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and underbrush, but there was nothing. No animal, no disturbance in the leaves, just the usual quiet of the night. I laughed at myself nervously and decided to call it a night. I wasn't going to let my imagination get the best of me. The woods were vast, and strange things happened in the dark. But I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was still out there, watching me. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up, settling into my sleeping bag. The night passed quietly, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things. Twigs snapping just outside the tent, the sound of something moving. Each time I opened my eyes, the dark corners of the tent seemed darker, and the wind carried an unfamiliar chill. Around 3 a.m., I woke up with a start. There was a noise, a soft scraping sound. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, but then the noise repeated. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I lay perfectly still, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from outside the tent. Slow, deliberate, like someone or something was dragging something across the ground. I wasn't sure if it was closer or farther away, but the feeling that I wasn't alone was undeniable. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop. Didn't. It continued, slow and steady, moving around the tent, just out of my sight. The wind had died down, and there were no other sounds now, just that scraping, dragging noise. I considered getting up and shining my flashlight out into the dark, but I didn't want to make a sound. What if I was dealing with a person? If someone was out there, I wasn't prepared. I wasn't armed, and there was no way I could outrun them in the dark. Minutes passed, and the sound continued. I could hear it moving further, and then suddenly, it stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, but the woods were still, deathly still. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, I heard the soft sound of someone, walking away. The footsteps were faint but unmistakable, moving away from my tent and into the woods. I didn't dare move for a long time, listening carefully for any sign of what might happen next. But everything remained eerily quiet. Eventually, I managed to convince myself it was some kind of animal or another camper. Maybe someone had gotten lost. I didn't know, but I needed sleep, so I finally closed my eyes and forced myself to drift off. Morning came slowly. The sun peeked through the trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. I woke up with a headache, but I was relieved that the night was over. I quickly packed up my camp, eager to leave the place. But as I began to gather my things, I noticed something odd. There, by the base of my tent, was a series of deep, wide grooves in the earth, like something heavy had been dragged across the ground. I knelt down, inspecting them. They weren't there when I set up camp. They weren't there the night before either. Someone or something had been close to my tent after all. I hurriedly packed the rest of my gear, my mind racing with possibilities. What had happened last night? Who or what had been outside my tent? The idea that it had been another person made my skin crawl, but I couldn't figure out why they hadn't made themselves known. I didn't want to stay another minute longer than necessary. The woods suddenly felt oppressive, like they were closing in on me. I packed the last of my things and got in my car, leaving the campsite behind. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I was miles away. Later, when I got home and checked my gear, I found something strange. A small, crumpled piece of paper tucked into my backpack. It wasn't something I had put there. I opened it up, my hands trembling. The paper was blank except for a single line of text. Asterisk, I'm still out here. Asterisk, I don't know who left it, and I don't know what it means. I don't even know if I'll ever go back to that campsite. But every time I hear a rustle in the woods, or feel a chill when I'm alone, I remember the dragging noise. I remember the footsteps in the night, and I wonder who or what is still out there. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just a weekend getaway to clear my head. The kind of trip I'd taken 100 times before. I had my gear packed, my food ready, and the trail in front of me was quiet. My friends couldn't make it this time, so it was just me, my tent, and the wilderness. I parked my car at the trailhead and grabbed my pack. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the dirt path. I didn't mind. I enjoyed the solitude. There's something peaceful about being alone in nature, just the sound of your footsteps on the trail and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The hike was easy, the trail was well marked, and the only thing that caught my attention were the birds overhead and the occasional squirrel darting across the path. As I walked, I thought about how great it would feel to be away from the noise of everyday life. No emails, no meetings, just the hum of the forest and the stillness of the mountains. It had been a long time since I'd had a chance to disconnect like this. I reached the campsite just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared. There was a small clearing beside a bubbling creek. The sound of the water was soothing. I set up my tent in the fading light, the familiar routine almost automatic. I wasn't worried about bears or anything. It was late in the season. Most of the wildlife had already started to hibernate or moved lower down the mountain. Once the tent was up, I started a small fire. The crackling flames pushed back the darkness a bit, but only just. The night felt thick, like the air itself was holding its breath. I cooked a quick dinner over the fire, the smell of grilled meat filling the air. It was nothing fancy, just something to keep me full until morning. By the time I finished eating, the stars were out, shining bright and cold above me. The fire crackled, and I sat there, staring into the flames. The heat from the fire was nice, but the night air was getting colder, a sharp reminder that autumn was setting in. I didn't think anything was unusual at first, but then, as the fire burned down to a few embers, I started hearing something. At first, it was just the soft rustling of leaves, or maybe an animal moving through the underbrush. I shrugged it off, but then the rustling stopped. There was a long, eerie silence, and that's when I heard it. A snap, a twig breaking, not far from the camp. I tensed, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. It wasn't the usual sound of an animal. It was too deliberate. too loud. I sat still, straining my ears. A soft crunch, like boots on the ground, followed by another twig snap. Then silence. I couldn't see anything in the dark. The fire wasn't bright enough to reveal the edges of the campsite. I reached for my flashlight, my hands suddenly feeling clammy. The beam sliced through the dark, illuminating the trees around me. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I thought it was probably just my nerves getting to me. After all, I was alone in the woods, and it's easy to imagine things when you're by yourself at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to call it a night. I extinguished the fire and climbed into my tent, zipping it up tight. The fabric of the tent was thin, but it gave me a false sense of security. I lay there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the forest, the wind in the trees, the occasional call of an owl, but I couldn't help but feel uneasy. Then again, that snap. I froze, staring at the tent walls, my breath shallow. This time it was much closer. My heart raced. I turned on my flashlight, unzipping the tent cautiously, peeking out into the darkness. Nothing. The shadows outside the tent were thick and still. I shone the flashlight around, but I couldn't see anything that could have made that sound. Maybe it was just a raccoon or something. I told myself that, trying to calm my racing mind. I was about to crawl back into the tent when I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. "Hello!" The sound came from somewhere off to the right, just beyond the trees. My stomach lurched. I thought maybe it was another camper, someone who had gotten lost or was just passing by. But then, I realized that there was no way anyone else should have been out here. The trail was only a few miles, and I hadn't seen anyone when I arrived. I hesitated for a long moment, not sure what to do. Should I call out? Should I ignore it? Then I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't just a voice. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. My heart started pounding in my chest. There was someone out there. I quickly zipped the tent up again, my mind racing. Who the hell was out there? Why were they sneaking around in the middle of the night? The fear began to build, each creak of the tent seeming to amplify the tension. I grabbed my phone, checking for a signal. Nothing. Of course, there wouldn't be a signal out here. I thought about calling the police, but I wasn't sure what I would even tell them. There was no real proof anything was wrong. The footsteps stopped. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. My mind was playing tricks on me, I told myself. But then the unmistakable sound of someone breathing, just outside the tent, chilled me to the bone. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in the tent all night, waiting for someone to find me. And I definitely couldn't go out there and confront whoever it was. So I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath, praying the person would go away. Minutes dragged on like hours. Finally, just when I thought I might lose my mind from the tension, I heard the footsteps retreat. They moved farther away, then disappeared into the woods. I waited a little longer, then slowly, cautiously, unzipped the tent and peered out. The woods were silent. The only sound was the distant babble of the creek. There was no sign of anyone. I stepped out of the tent, my eyes scanning the trees around me. Nothing, just the quiet rustling of leaves in the wind. I breathed a sigh of relief, but the unease remained. Something was definitely wrong, but I couldn't explain it. I packed up my tent the next morning, feeling the need to leave as soon as possible. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the campsite, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just narrowly avoided something dangerous. The hike back to the car was uneventful. The trail, which had felt peaceful the day before, now seemed ominous. The trees looked different, and every rustle of a branch made my heart race. When I reached my car, I locked the doors behind me, started the engine, and pulled away from the trailhead. I glanced in the rearview mirror as I drove away, but there was nothing but trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me the entire time. The rest of the drive home was a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps, the voice, the breathing outside my tent. I never found out who or what it was, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going camping alone again. It was supposed to be a quiet, relaxing weekend in the woods. I'd spent weeks planning this trip. Just me, the wilderness, and some time to clear my head. I'd rented a small cabin at the edge of a secluded forest, far enough from the town for peace and quiet, but close enough to the road that I wouldn't feel completely isolated. I'd made sure to pack everything: food, water, sleeping bag, flashlight, a first aid kit, and my phone, though I wasn't expecting much service. Arriving at the cabin late in the afternoon, I was pleased to see I was the only one there. The place was rustic but well-maintained, with a small porch and a single room inside, the kind of spot you would expect to find in an old camping brochure. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the trees, and the air was still and cool. A perfect evening to start my trip. I spent the first few hours unpacking, settling in. I made a simple dinner: canned beans, some trail mix, and a hot drink. Afterward, I sat outside for a bit, the quiet of the forest wrapping around me like a blanket. Birds were calling from far off, and the wind whispered through the trees. There was no one around, and it felt like the world had slowed down. As night fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. I retreated into the cabin, lit a couple of candles, and read a book by the dim light. The peacefulness I had been hoping for settled in. But after a while, a strange restlessness began to settle in with me. The cabin creaked as the wind pushed against the walls, but it wasn't that bothered me. It was the silence that followed, the kind of silence that felt too thick, too heavy, like something was missing. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just anxious from being away from home. But when the silence stretched on too long, my mind started to wander, thinking about all the things that could go wrong when you're out in the woods by yourself. It wasn't an irrational fear. People get lost. Animals can be unpredictable. And then there's the general sense of vulnerability. If something happened out here, it would take hours before anyone would even know. I pulled the blanket tighter around myself, trying to shake off the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I turned out the candles and settled in for the night. But sleep didn't come easy. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a sudden, sharp crack, a loud snap from somewhere outside. My heart raced, and my eyes darted toward the window. The moonlight was faint, but I could still make out the shadows of trees swaying outside. I told myself it was nothing, a branch breaking, maybe, but the noise hadn't sounded like a branch. It had sounded deliberate, like someone had stepped on it. I waited for a few moments, listening. There was no other sound. The forest was quiet again. I considered getting up to check, but then I thought, what for? It's probably just an animal. But that didn't sit well with me. There was something unsettling about it. I tried to settle back into bed, but sleep refused to come. I tossed and turned, and after what felt like hours, I finally gave up. I grabbed my flashlight, put on my jacket, and decided to step outside to take a look. The night air was cold, the kind that bites at your skin. The woods stretched out in front of me, dark and silent. My flashlight flickered slightly as I swept it over the ground, searching for any signs of what might have caused the noise. I didn't want to admit it, but the longer I stood there, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. Every rustle in the leaves, every distant snap of a twig, sent a shiver up my spine. I walked around the cabin, checking the perimeter. Nothing seemed out of place. No broken branches, no footprints, just the usual stillness of the forest. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, the dark and the quiet amplifying every small sound. But as I turned back toward the cabin, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the corner of my eye. I snapped my head toward it, but there was nothing there. My heart started racing again. I wasn't sure what I had seen, but the feeling that I wasn't alone was stronger now. I glanced around nervously, my flashlight beam cutting through the trees, revealing only shadows. I decided to go back inside, but as I reached for the door, I froze. There, on the cabin's wooden steps, was a small pile of dirt. It hadn't been there when I'd first arrived. I was sure of it. I stepped closer, shining the light on it, and noticed something strange. There were tiny scratches in the dirt, almost like something had been dragged through it. My mind started racing. I forced myself to stay calm, to think logically. Could be animals, I thought. Maybe some sort of wild animal had left it there. But then, my flashlight flickered again, and I heard a noise behind me. A low, almost imperceptible rustling. I spun around, my pulse pounding in my ears. I saw nothing, but that feeling, the one I couldn't shake, was back again, heavier than before. I quickly ducked inside the cabin, locking the door behind me. For the next several hours, I sat in the dark, listening. The silence was oppressive now. Every little noise seemed louder, more distinct. I was almost too afraid to even breathe too loudly. The cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in on me. There was no more peace, just that same suffocating silence. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the unease stayed with me. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin's wooden walls, I decided it was time to pack up and leave. I'd gotten what I needed, peace, solitude, but it wasn't worth it anymore. Whatever had happened last night, whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. I was just about to gather my things when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves outside. I froze, my hand gripping the handle of the door. I had no idea how long they'd been there, but they were getting closer. There was no mistaking it now. Someone or something was out there. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for whatever was coming next. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. I stayed where I was for what felt like an eternity. Slowly, carefully, I grabbed my backpack and slipped out the back door of the cabin, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove away without a second thought. I didn't know who or what had been following me, but I didn't need to. It was enough to know that I was leaving it all behind. It's been weeks now since I've been back. Every so often, I think about what happened that night, about the footsteps, the feeling that I wasn't alone. But I don't dwell on it. I don't need to, because I know one thing for sure, whatever it was, it never meant to hurt me. And that's the only reason I'm still here, alive and well. I've always loved the outdoors. The sound of leaves rustling in the wind, the crackling of a campfire, the smell of pine trees, and the peacefulness of being far away from the noise of the city. It was always a welcome break. So, when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in a remote forest, I was excited. I didn't expect anything weird or out of the ordinary to happen. Just a few days to disconnect from everything and unwind. But, of course, I was wrong. The campsite I picked was deep in the forest. A small, well-known spot that most people avoid since it's a little farther from the main trail. The perfect place to be alone with no one around for miles. I packed everything I thought I'd need. A small tent, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a stove, food, and plenty of water. I even brought my favorite book to read by the fire. The hike to the site was tiring, especially with a heavy backpack, but the views along the way were beautiful. The trees towered above me, and the forest floor was covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves. The further I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no animals, just the sound of my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. When I finally reached the campsite, I was relieved. It was just as I remembered it, tucked between two tall pines, with a small clearing perfect for setting up the tent. The ground was uneven, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. I unpacked and set up the tent. It was still early in the afternoon, so I decided to start a fire and relax. As the flames flickered and crackled, I sat back on a log and watched the smoke rise into the air. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, and the air grew cooler. It was peaceful, too peaceful almost. That's when I noticed it, the silence. It was strange, almost suffocating. I had been expecting the usual sounds of animals or birds, even the occasional wind in the trees. But there was nothing, just quiet. At first, I thought it was just because it was getting late. Maybe the animals had all retreated for the night. But as the minutes passed, the silence started to feel unnatural. I shook it off and tried to focus on my book. But I couldn't concentrate. I kept looking around, scanning the trees and the shadows. My nerves were getting the best of me. There was no reason to feel this way, nothing had happened. Yet, I couldn't ignore the creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. The darkness deepened as night fell, and I decided it was time to turn in for the night. I snuffed out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped it up. The inside of the tent felt a little too small, a little too closed off, but I tried to relax. I lay on my back, staring up at the dark ceiling of the tent, listening to the sounds of the wind. The wind outside started picking up, rustling the branches of the trees. But it wasn't just wind. It sounded like something was moving in the forest. Something bigger. My heart rate picked up. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer, maybe a bear. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft thud. A faint sound of something heavy landing on the ground. It came from the direction of the trees. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The wind howled louder now, and the sound of leaves shifting in the breeze only made the noise seem even more pronounced. I strained to listen, but the forest around me was too dark to see anything. It wasn't until a second thud came that I realized whatever it was moving. Slowly, carefully. I held my breath. I had to be imagining it. But the sound came again. Louder this time, closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I reached for the flashlight beside me, gripping it tightly. The only thing keeping me calm was knowing that if I needed to, I could shine the light out of the tent and see what was out there. Another thud, closer still. I held the flashlight in my trembling hands, and I listened as the noise continued. It wasn't a creature moving like I expected. It was too deliberate, too calculated. And it wasn't just one sound, it was several in a rhythm coming from different directions. Something was circling me. I wanted to call out, to shout, to do something, but my voice was caught in my throat. Instead, I just lay there, terrified, waiting for whatever it was to make the next move. I heard something then that I will never forget. Footsteps, soft and measured, crunching on the dry ground outside my tent. The weight of each step sent shivers down my spine. Whoever or whatever was out there was close, very close. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare make a sound. The footsteps grew louder, and I could feel them getting closer. My hands were clammy, my breathing shallow. I had never felt more alone in my life. Suddenly, the tent shifted. I nearly screamed as I felt the fabric of the tent press against my side, as though something had brushed past it. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears that I thought for sure whoever, or whatever, was outside could hear it too. I held my breath. Nothing happened for a long time. It felt like hours, but in reality, it had only been a few minutes. Finally, I dared to move. I shifted my weight and slowly, ever so carefully, reached for the zipper of the tent. I was going to do it. I was going to open it and see who or what was out there. Just as I was about to unzip the door, I heard a voice, a faint, distant voice, barely above a whisper. Help! My blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable. It was a human voice. It was then that I realized what was happening. There was someone else out there, and they were trying to get to me. Not just an animal, not just a shadow in the trees. Someone was out there watching me. My mind raced. What should I do? Should I wait it out? Stay hidden in my tent? Should I make a run for it? My options felt limited. I had no way of knowing what was really out there. I waited, paralyzed by fear. The minutes dragged on, and I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent. Just a little bit. My heart hammered in my chest as I slowly, carefully, peeked outside. The forest was still, eerily still. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees. There was no one, no movement, nothing. I waited for what felt like forever, expecting something to jump out at me at any moment. But nothing happened. The camp was silent again. I finally decided to step outside. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, scanning the area. The light cut through the darkness, revealing only the trees, the rocks, the ground beneath me. I stood there for a long time, looking around, listening, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no whispers, no signs of anything out of the ordinary. I didn't understand. I was sure something had been there, but there was no trace of it. No sign of whoever or whatever had been out there. I spent the rest of the night with the flashlight in hand, constantly scanning the forest around me. My nerves were shot, but I refused to leave the safety of my tent. It wasn't until the first light of dawn broke through the trees that I finally felt like I could breathe again. I packed up my camp quickly, my hands still shaking. I didn't stick around to find out what had really happened. Whatever it was, I wanted no part of it. I had made the decision right then and there to never come back to this place. I left the forest behind, walking as quickly as I could. When I finally reached the main trail, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The forest had its secrets, and I wasn't going to try to uncover them. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. Just me, my tent, and the wilderness. I'd been longing for some time alone, away from the constant noise of the city. The air would be cleaner, the sky clearer, and the only sounds would be the rustling of leaves and the crackle of a campfire.
No distractions. No rush.
Just me and nature. I picked a spot deep in the woods, miles from any other campers. I had a map, a compass, and all the supplies I thought I'd need. The sky was a perfect blue when I arrived, the kind of perfect blue you only get in the spring, the kind that makes everything feel crisp and new. I set up my tent near a small creek, its water gurgling softly, the perfect background noise. The first night passed without issue. The fire kept me warm, the night air cool but not cold, just the way I liked it. As the fire flickered and popped, I thought I heard something in the distance, something faint. It didn't sound like an animal, more like the sound of footsteps, heavy ones. I brushed it off, probably just a deer or a bear wandering nearby. But that night, as I lay in my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sounds outside seemed louder, closer. The wind through the trees sounded different, more aggressive, as if the woods themselves were alive, watching me. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me, trying to ignore it, but the unease only grew. The next day, I decided to explore the area. There was a hiking trail not far from where I'd set up camp, and I figured getting some exercise would clear my head. The trail twisted through thick trees and underbrush. Birds chirped overhead, and squirrels darted across the path. For a while, I forgot about the strange feeling from the night before. I was too busy taking in the beauty of the woods. About an hour into the hike, I found an old, dilapidated cabin. It was barely standing, the roof sagging and half of the walls rotting away. There was a strange sense of abandonment about it, and I couldn't help but be curious. I pushed through the overgrown weeds and carefully stepped inside. The air inside was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under my weight. It was just an old hunting cabin, I told myself. There was nothing special about it. But as I explored, I found something odd. A small journal, hidden under the floorboards. The leather cover was cracked, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. I opened it, and as I read, my stomach dropped. The journal belonged to someone named Thomas. He had written about his time in the woods, his hunting trips, and his encounters with the animals in the area. First, it seemed normal, but then things took a darker turn. Thomas wrote about hearing strange noises at night, scratching at the door of the cabin, voices calling out from the woods. He described waking up in the middle of the night, only to find his campsite disturbed. His gear moved. There were entries that spoke of a feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the trees. But the most unsettling part was his final entry, written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. I'm leaving. It's not safe anymore. I can hear them. I know they're watching me. Don't trust the trees. They know you're here. Underscore the last page was blank. I closed the journal, my hands shaking. I couldn't explain why, but a sense of dread washed over me. Maybe it was just the ramblings of a man who had been alone for too long, but something about it felt real. I quickly left the cabin and retraced my steps back to camp, my mind racing. That night, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves seemed louder than it should have been. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the journal get to me, but I couldn't ignore the feeling in the pit of my stomach. I decided to stay up late, hoping that if I kept the fire burning, I'd feel safer. But as the night grew darker, the woods around me seemed to grow quieter, the usual nighttime sounds fading away. Even the creek had quieted, its babbling reduced to a mere whisper. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl. It was distant at first, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. But then it came again, closer this time. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the trees around me. The growl wasn't from any animal I knew. It wasn't the typical growl of a bear or wolf. It was something deeper, more primal, as though it came from the very earth itself. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing there, just the dark shadows of the trees. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was probably just an animal, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The growl came again, closer this time. It sounded almost like it was circling me. I froze, not daring to move. Then there was a loud snap, a branch breaking underfoot. It was right behind me. I whipped around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness of the woods, stretching endlessly in all directions. My heart was hammering in my chest, my hands trembling as I clutched the flashlight. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening. It was just a deer, or maybe a bear, but it didn't feel right. It didn't feel natural. Suddenly, the growl came again, closer than ever, and this time, I heard something else. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps, like someone was walking through the woods, deliberately trying to make their presence known. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my backpack, threw it over my shoulder, and started running. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out of the woods, away from whatever was following me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed through the underbrush, my feet slipping on the uneven ground. The footsteps were still behind me, getting closer with each passing second. I could hear them, slow, deliberate, like someone was enjoying the chase. Panic surged in my chest, and I ran faster, my legs burning, my mind screaming at me to keep going, to not stop. I stumbled through the woods for what felt like hours, not stopping, not looking back. Eventually, I came to a clearing, and there, in the center of the clearing, was my campsite. But something was wrong. My tent was gone. The fire had been snuffed out, and the entire area was eerily still. My heart skipped a beat as I looked around. There was no sign of the figure that had been chasing me, no sign of anything. It was as though the woods had swallowed me whole, leaving me with nothing but silence. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of what had happened. The sun was starting to rise, the first light of dawn creeping through the trees. It was over. Whatever it was, whatever had been following me, had disappeared with the night. I never found out what had been stalking me in those woods. But I do know this. The woods aren't just a backdrop for camping trips. They're alive in their own way, holding onto their secrets. And sometimes, it's best to leave them undisturbed. I packed up my gear and left the woods as quickly as I could, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line. I didn't stop until I was back in the safety of my car, driving away from that place. And I promised myself that I'd never return. Some things are better left unexplored. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a chance to escape the noise of everyday life and disconnect from everything. I needed peace, space to clear my head, and a bit of solitude. So, I packed my tent, some food, and a few essentials, ready to head out to a remote camping site I had found online. It was far away from the city, nestled deep in a wooded area by a river, and the reviews were full of people raving about how quiet and beautiful the spot was. The drive took longer than expected, but the landscape was stunning. The road got narrower the further I went, winding its way through thick forest. I didn't see another car for miles. Eventually, the road stopped and the campsite was right there in front of me. It was late afternoon by the time I arrived, so the sun was still up, but the trees cast long shadows, making the place feel eerily secluded. I unpacked the car and set up my tent near the riverbank. The sound of the water was calming, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. The air was fresh, the forest smelled like pine and earth, and there were no distractions, no rush, just the simple act of setting up camp. I didn't even feel the need to hurry. It was as though the forest itself had a way of slowing time. As the evening approached, I lit a small fire and sat by the river, listening to the crackling of the wood. I had brought a book, but I was too distracted by the beauty of my surroundings to read. The quiet was different from the quiet back home. It wasn't the silence of an empty house, but the silence of nature, the kind that feels alive, where every rustle in the trees could be a bird or a squirrel or something else entirely. The sun set behind the trees, and the sky turned a deep shade of purple. That's when I noticed something odd. In the distance, past the tree line where the forest got thicker, I thought I saw something move. It was hard to make out, just a dark shape blending in with the shadows. At first, I dismissed it as an animal, but the way it moved felt off. Too deliberate, too steady for an animal. Could have been a person, but there was no trail or path leading to that area. I shrugged it off. Maybe I was just seeing things. I stayed by the fire a little longer, roasting marshmallows, listening to the soft murmur of the river, and watching the fire flicker. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay down. The quietness of the night was almost suffocating, but in a strange way, it was comforting too. The sounds of the forest, the gentle rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl, seemed to lull me to sleep. But I didn't sleep well. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure what had pulled me from my dream, but something didn't feel right. My heart was pounding, my body stiff, as if every muscle was on high alert. The fire outside had long since burned out, and now there was nothing but the darkness around me. I lay still in my sleeping bag, listening. At first, I thought I could hear the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. They weren't loud, but they were there. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, though I'd heard no signs of wildlife since I'd settled in. I forced myself to be logical, to breathe steadily, to focus on the sound of my own pulse in the quiet. Then I heard something else, a faint tapping sound. At first, it was just one or two, barely audible. Then it came again, louder this time, like someone was knocking gently on the side of my tent. I froze, too scared to move, too scared to breathe. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a branch brushing against the fabric, the wind playing tricks. But no, it didn't sound like that. It sounded intentional. The knocking continued, a few seconds between each tap, just enough to let me know it wasn't random. I wasn't sure what to do. My phone was in my bag on the other side of the tent, and I didn't want to make any sudden movements. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the sounds, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then the sound stopped. I waited. A few minutes later, there was another sound. This time, it was more of a dragging noise, like something heavy was being pulled across the ground. I could feel it now, an overwhelming sense of dread. My gut told me something was wrong, that whatever was out there wasn't just a curious animal or a harmless wanderer. I didn't know what it was, but it wasn't good. I stayed as still as I could, waiting for the noise to stop. My mind raced. Should I grab my stuff and run? Should I shout? Couldn't decide. I kept telling myself that I was overreacting, but every part of me screamed that something was wrong. Then the noise stopped again. Silence. Dead silence. I dared to peek out of the tent. I unzipped the tiniest gap, just enough to look outside. The forest was as dark as ink, with no sign of movement. I stared into the night, trying to make sense of it. Everything was still, and yet, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, I heard a low, guttural growl. It came from the woods, from deeper within the trees, too close for comfort. My heart stopped, my blood went cold. The sound wasn't from a bear or any animal I recognized. It was something else, human but not. Something twisted. Panic surged through me, and before I could stop myself, I unzipped the tent fully and bolted out into the night. I had to get out of there. I didn't know why, but I had this overwhelming sense that if I stayed there, I would never leave. I grabbed my bag and sprinted toward the road, away from the river, away from the woods. My breath was ragged, my legs burning, but I didn't stop. I didn't care if I ran for miles. I just needed to get away. The road was still empty when I reached it. I kept running, not looking back, not slowing down until I reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, trying to unlock it as quickly as possible. My hands were shaking, my vision blurred from the fear. Finally, I got inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I didn't move for a while. I just sat there, catching my breath, staring at the dark road ahead. I had no idea who or what was out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I was not going back to that campsite. The whole experience felt like a nightmare, but I knew it had been real. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me, but the road was empty. The forest, quiet once more, was behind me. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Who would believe me? I never went camping again. Something had been out there, something that didn't belong, and I wasn't willing to risk finding out what it was. I still don't know what it was, but I know I'll never forget the sounds, the fear, and the deep, gut-wrenching feeling that I was not alone. I've been camping a lot over the years. It's one of those activities I do to clear my mind, get away from the chaos of the world. Sometimes I go with friends, other times alone. This one trip, though, I was by myself. I don't know why I chose this particular spot, tucked away deep in the woods. I guess I was looking for some solitude, a quiet place where I could just think. My phone had no signal, and that was fine by me. I wasn't expecting any kind of distractions. The drive was long, and by the time I arrived, the sun was just starting to dip behind the horizon. I unloaded my gear from the truck, setting up camp at the edge of a small clearing. The trees surrounding me were thick, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. The air was cool, crisp, a welcome change from the heat of the day. I set up my tent, gathered some dry wood for a fire, and got it started. The crackling of the flames was comforting, and I sat down, staring into the fire, letting the warmth spread across my cold fingers. It was one of those perfect nights where everything felt just right. The sky was clear, stars flickered overhead, and all around me, the woods were still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. But as the night wore on, something didn't sit right with me. At first, I brushed it off, just the usual unsettling feeling that comes with being alone in the wilderness. It wasn't anything specific, just a general sense that I wasn't completely alone. The feeling lingered like an itch I couldn't scratch. I tried to shake it off. I focused on the fire, threw another log on, and listened to the sounds of the forest, crickets, the wind rustling in the trees, the occasional hoot of an owl. The noises of the night were familiar, but tonight they felt different. Not in a supernatural way, but in a way that made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I started to feel like I was being watched. I looked around the clearing. Nothing. Just trees, shadows stretching across the ground from the firelight. I forced myself to laugh it off. It was silly. I was a seasoned camper. I knew how to survive out here. I'd been through worse situations than a few unsettling moments in the dark. The fire crackled again, sending sparks up into the air, and I stared into the flames for a while, trying to push the uneasy feeling out of my mind. That's when I heard it. A noise, soft at first, then clearer. A faint rustling in the brush just outside my camp. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to stay calm. Could be anything. A raccoon, a squirrel, maybe even a deer. There was no reason to panic. I stood up slowly, trying not to make a sound, and grabbed the flashlight I'd left beside me. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees. Nothing, just the shadows, the flickering of the firelight. Still, the feeling persisted. I sat back down by the fire, trying to shake the tension in my body. The rustling sound stopped, and the forest seemed to return to its normal rhythm. I told myself that it was nothing, probably just an animal or maybe the wind messing with the branches. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just in my head. It was a physical presence, something out there in the dark, just beyond the light of my campfire. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. I had camped alone before many times, but tonight felt different. I kept my eyes on the tree lean, scanning for any movement. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a shadow, shifting between the trees. But when I looked closer, there was nothing there. I was starting to feel paranoid, so I decided to distract myself. I reached into my backpack and pulled out a book, something to keep my mind off the creeping sense of unease. But as I opened it, a sudden noise broke through the silence again, this time closer. A snap like a twig breaking underfoot. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't normal. This wasn't the sound of an animal. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. I could feel my heart start to race. I stood up again, flashlight in hand, and pointed it toward the source of the noise. My breath fogged in the cold air as I shined the beam into the trees. Nothing. There was no movement, no animals, just the dark, dense woods surrounding me. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Figure just for a moment, just enough to make my blood run cold. It was a person, but they were standing so still, almost blending into the darkness, that I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. I felt my stomach drop, the fear I had tried to ignore rising up into my chest. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, especially this late at night? The thought that someone might be watching me, deliberately hiding just out of sight, sent a chill down my spine. I knew I needed to stay calm. I needed to think clearly. Maybe it was just a hiker, someone else who'd gotten lost in the woods. But then again, why would they be so far off the beaten path, standing perfectly still, without a word? I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my phone from my bag, but of course, there was no signal. That left me with only one option. I grabbed the keys to my truck and headed in that direction. My hands shook as I gripped the flashlight, my footsteps cautious but determined. The closer I got, the more I could hear it. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, not far from where I was. I didn't dare call out. I just kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A trail of broken branches led into the trees, the kind of trail you'd see if someone or something had been moving through the forest. But it wasn't a natural path. It was too intentional, too straight. I hesitated, my mind racing. Should I follow the trail? Should I go back to my camp and hide in the tent? The thought of being alone in that tent with whatever or whoever was out there made my skin crawl even more. I decided to turn back. But as I did, I heard a voice. Not a whisper, but a clear, calm voice just behind me, going somewhere. I had always loved camping. There was something peaceful about being surrounded by nature, far from the noise and stress of everyday life. This time, I decided to go camping alone. I thought it would be a good way to reset, to get away from everything for a few days and clear my mind. It was mid-September, and the weather was still warm, so I figured it would be the perfect time to head into the woods. I'd chosen a remote spot deep in the forest, a place I'd read about in a hiking forum. It was known for its solitude and stunning views. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just nature. I packed my gear into my old SUV, grabbing the usual: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a few tools. I made sure to bring my compass, a map, and a flashlight, just in case, though I'd done this plenty of times before and I figured I didn't need much. I reached the trailhead late in the afternoon, around 5 p.m. It was already starting to get dark, but I was confident I could make it to my campsite before night fully set in. The trail was narrow and winding, marked only by small signs nailed to trees. The air was cool and fresh, with a faint smell of pine and earth. The sound of distant birds and rustling leaves was calming. I was in my element. As I walked deeper into the woods, the path began to feel more secluded. The trees closed in on either side, their tall trunks towering over me, blocking out the sun. The light began to fade quickly, and soon, I found myself surrounded by thick shadows. I hadn't realized how much time had passed, but I still had enough daylight to set up camp. I quickened my pace, eager to get to the clearing I had read about. Eventually, I reached it, a small, peaceful clearing with a small creek running nearby. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over everything. I set up my tent quickly, feeling good about the spot I'd chosen. It was isolated, which I liked, but there was a certain peacefulness about it too. I built a fire to ward off the chill of the evening, the crackling flames providing a bit of light in the otherwise darkening world. I cooked myself a simple meal, beans and rice, and ate it slowly, savoring the silence. The fire popped and crackled, and I could hear the gentle flow of the creek nearby. I made sure to keep my campfire going, just in case, but I knew I wouldn't need it for warmth. The night was still warm, the air crisp but not uncomfortable. It was the perfect night for camping. But as the night stretched on, something started to feel off. At first, I thought it was just the quiet, the kind of stillness that settles in when you're alone in the woods. But there was something else, a sense that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. The first sign was the rustling in the bushes across the creek. At first, I assumed it was a deer or maybe a raccoon moving around, but the rustling seemed too deliberate, too consistent. The wind had died down and the trees were still. I stood up, peering into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. My heart rate quickened. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. I tried to brush it off. It was probably an animal, just something moving through the brush. I sat back down by the fire, trying to convince myself of that. But as the night went on, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Every little sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made me tense up. It felt like someone or something was nearby, just out of sight. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. I doused the fire and crawled into my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling in my gut. I kept my flashlight within reach just in case. I lay there for hours, listening to the sounds of the forest. The creek continued to flow, the wind began to pick up again, and the occasional bird would call out in the distance. But every so often, I would hear something else, something not quite right. A footstep, faint movement, something breathing just beyond the reach of my campfire light. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it or if there was someone or something out there. The fear began to build, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to think rationally. If it was an animal, it wouldn't be out here alone. But the sounds were different now, too close, too deliberate. Not the usual rustling of wildlife. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the dark. The beam swept across the clearing, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. My heart pounded louder, and I sat up in my sleeping bag, trying to shake off the fear. But something in my gut told me this wasn't normal. I reached for my backpack and fumbled for my phone. No service, as I had expected. The phone was useless, but I had to do something. I grabbed my compass and checked the direction. I could retrace my steps in the morning. It was still early enough to leave if I needed to, but I didn't want to overreact as I lay there in the dark. I started to hear it more clearly, a soft scraping sound, as though something was dragging across the ground. Slowly, carefully moving around my campsite, I froze, barely breathing. The sound came again, closer this time, and I heard someone, moving through the trees. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the direction. It wasn't an animal. It was too slow, too methodical. I couldn't stay in the tent anymore. My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make a sound, and crept outside. I crouched low, listening, heart pounding in my chest. The woods were eerily quiet now. No rustling, no movement, but that scraping sound kept getting closer, like something was circling me. I grabbed my gear, my backpack, my compass, and my flashlight, and began to move. I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to leave, but I couldn't afford to panic. I kept low to the ground, moving as quietly as I could, but every step felt like a shout in the silence. The scraping sound was almost directly behind me now. I dared not look back. I was about halfway to the trail when I heard a voice, a low whisper, barely audible, drifting on the wind. It wasn't human. It was garbled, like someone or something trying to speak through a mask. I stopped dead in my tracks, breath catching in my throat. The whisper came again, this time clearer. Not safe, not safe. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran. I didn't care about anything but getting out of the woods. I didn't look back. I didn't stop to breathe. I just ran, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly as I made my way back to the trailhead. It felt like hours before I finally saw the familiar markings of the trail, but I didn't slow down until I reached my SUV. I slammed the door shut and locked it, breathless and trembling. My body was on autopilot as I started the engine and drove out of there, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. It wasn't until I was back on the main highway, miles away from the forest, that I started to calm down. I couldn't explain what had happened. Maybe it was an animal, maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. But the whispering voice, the scraping sound, it all felt too real. I don't know if I'll ever camp in those woods again. The thought of returning makes my skin crawl. All I know is that I'll be more cautious next time. I won't take the woods for granted, and I'll trust my instincts no matter how strange the feeling is. Because sometimes the woods don't just call to you, they wait. I've always loved the outdoors, the stillness of it all. Growing up, my dad used to take me hiking every other weekend, so the wilderness never felt foreign or intimidating to me. Felt like home. That's why when I decided to spend a long weekend camping by myself in the remote parts of a state forest, I didn't think much of it. Just me, a small tent, and a few basic supplies. What more could I want? The plan was simple. Hike in about 10 miles from the nearest road, set up camp near a small creek I'd marked on my map, and spend a few days soaking in the solitude. I wanted to disconnect completely. No phone, no GPS, just an old-school compass and topographic map. I had enough food for 4 days, a small propane stove, and a good sleeping bag for the cold nights. Everything was packed tight in my 60-liter backpack. The drive out was uneventful. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, then to dirt, and finally faded into an overgrown trailhead marked only by a rusty signpost. I parked my car, locked it up, and slung my pack onto my shoulders. The first stretch of the trail was steep, with dense pines on either side. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of a squirrel darting through the underbrush. It was exactly what I'd been craving. About 4 hours in, I reached the creek. It wasn't much, just a narrow ribbon of clear water winding through a small clearing, but it was perfect. The ground nearby was flat and soft, and the trees provided just enough shade. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and spent the rest of the afternoon gathering firewood and exploring the area. The creek had small fish darting in the shallows, and I even spotted a few deer tracks in the mud. Everything felt peaceful. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal of instant rice and canned beans, watched the sun dip below the treetops, and climbed into my tent as the temperature dropped. The silence was almost overwhelming, but in a comforting way. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the distant sound of the creek. The next day, I decided to hike further up the creek. I wanted to see if I could find the source, maybe a spring or a small pond. The map didn't show much detail, just a faint line where the creek started. I packed a small day bag with water, snacks, and a knife, leaving most of my gear back at camp. The hike was slow going. The further I went, the rougher the terrain became. The creek wound through dense thickets and over rocky outcrops. I had to climb over fallen logs and wade through shallow pools. But it was worth it. About 2 miles in, I stumbled upon a small waterfall, maybe 10 feet high, cascading into a crystal clear pool. It was stunning. I spent some time there taking it all in. I even filled my water bottle from the pool, letting the cold water wash over my hands. It felt untouched, like I was the first person to ever find it. After a while, I decided to head back to camp. The sun was already dipping lower in the sky, and I didn't want to risk getting caught out here after dark. That's when I first noticed it, a faint, uneasy feeling. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I'd been alone for over 24 hours now, and the isolation was probably playing tricks on me. But as I made my way back down the creek, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me stop and look around. But there was nothing, just the forest, still and quiet. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was almost gone. I built up the fire and sat close to it, listening to the night. The uneasiness hadn't left me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the dark trees for movement, but there was nothing. After a while, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. It's easy to let your mind wander when you're alone in the woods. I ate a quick dinner and crawled into my tent, leaving the fire burning low outside. That night, I woke up to a sound. At first, I couldn't place it. It was faint, almost drowned out by the rustling leaves and the creek. But it was there, a steady, deliberate crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started pounding. I lay there, completely still, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. My mind raced. Could be an animal, I told myself. A deer or maybe a raccoon. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The steps were too heavy, too purposeful. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly in my hand. My other hand went to the zipper of my tent, but I didn't open it. I just listened. The footsteps circled my camp, slow and deliberate. They stopped for a moment, then started again, moving closer to the tent. My breathing was shallow, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Whoever or whatever was out there, they were taking their time. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. I waited, listening intently. The forest was silent again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there, clutching my knife and staring at the tent's thin walls, waiting for the first light of dawn. When morning came, I stepped out of the tent cautiously, knife in hand. The fire had burned out, but everything else seemed untouched. No signs of an animal raid, no tracks around the tent. I convinced myself it had been my imagination, or maybe an animal after all. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. I decided to stay one more night. I didn't want to cut my trip short over a little paranoia. During the day, I kept busy, exploring the area around the creek and gathering more firewood. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every so often, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder or pausing to listen. The forest felt different now, less welcoming. That night, I built the fire bigger than usual. I sat close to it, knife within reach, trying to stay alert. The hours dragged on. Just as I was beginning to think I'd scared myself for nothing, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were coming from the opposite direction, out of the dense trees behind my camp. My heart started racing. I grabbed the knife and stood up, staring into the darkness. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond that was pitch black. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer, just the sound of the footsteps growing louder. I backed up toward the fire, holding the knife out in front of me. The footsteps stopped just outside the circle of light. I squinted, trying to see who or what was out there, but the darkness was impenetrable. For a long moment, everything was silent. Then, without warning, the footsteps retreated, moving quickly back into the trees. I stood there, frozen, until the sound faded completely. My legs were trembling, and my mouth was dry. I didn't know what to do. Should I pack up and leave right then, or wait until morning? Either way, I knew I wouldn't sleep. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, knife in hand, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. The forest was silent again, but I didn't trust it. The hike back to the trailhead felt like the longest trek of my life. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made my heart race. I kept checking the map, making sure I was on the right path. When I finally saw my car through the trees, I almost cried with relief. I threw my pack in the trunk, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. It wasn't until I was miles down the road, surrounded by open fields and the distant hum of traffic, that I finally started to relax. To this day, I don't know what happened out there. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me after too much time alone. But a part of me isn't so sure. I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. The sun was sinking low when I finally found the campsite. The light was fading fast, casting long shadows across the uneven terrain. It wasn't an official site, just a clearing I'd marked on my map during one of my solo hikes months ago. The place seemed perfect for a weekend away from everything. Remote, quiet, and surrounded by towering pines. I dropped my heavy pack to the ground and exhaled deeply, feeling the tension ease from my shoulders. This was what I needed. A break from the grind and some time to clear my head. Setting up camp became my immediate priority. The clearing was flat and dry, with plenty of room for my small tent. I pitched it quickly, the well-practiced motions coming back like muscle memory. My gear was reliable and I trusted it. A sturdy tent, a warm sleeping bag, and a camp stove that had never let me down. Once the tent was up, I gathered some stones to form a fire pit and arranged a pile of dry wood I'd collected along the trail. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit the fire, the flames crackling to life in the still evening air. The warmth felt good against the growing chill. I sat close to it, heating up a simple meal of dehydrated chili and rice. The smell was comforting, familiar. Alone in the wilderness, every sense seemed heightened. The night air smelled of pine and earth. The distant sound of a stream reached my ears, blending with the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. By the time I finished eating, the forest was fully dark. The stars above were dazzling, their light unobstructed by city pollution. I leaned back against a fallen log, watching them, letting the fire's warmth seep into my skin. There was something peaceful about this solitude, a reminder of how small I was in the grand scheme of things. But as the fire burned lower, the peace gave way to unease. I wasn't sure what caused it. Maybe it was the way the wind seemed to whisper through the trees, or how the shadows beyond the firelight seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. It wasn't fear, not yet, but a kind of alertness. I'd been camping alone enough to know that these feelings weren't unusual. The wilderness was vast and indifferent. It didn't care about me, but it also wasn't out to get me. Still, I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire thoroughly, stirring the ashes with a stick to ensure every ember was out. Then I climbed into my tent, zipping it up tightly. Inside, it was cozy. The smell of synthetic fabric mixed with the faint scent of pine. I burrowed into my sleeping bag, listening to the faint sounds of the forest. An owl hooting in the distance, the occasional snap of a twig. It didn't take long for sleep to claim me. I woke abruptly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. The forest was silent, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. My heart was pounding, though I couldn't pinpoint what had startled me. I lay there for a moment, holding my breath, ears straining for any sound. And then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic crunching noise, like footsteps on dry leaves. My first thought was that it was an animal. Deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But the sound didn't match. It was too deliberate, too steady. Stopped, started again, then stopped once more. My chest tightened as I realized it was circling the tent. Someone was out there. I stayed perfectly still, my hand slowly reaching for the knife I kept near the entrance of the tent. My breathing was shallow, each inhale and exhale sounding deafening in the silence. The footsteps paused directly in front of the tent, just inches away from where I lay. Whoever it was didn't speak, didn't make any other noise, just stood there. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The thin fabric of the tent offered no protection, no real barrier. I could see the faint outline of their shadow against the nylon, distorted by the dim moonlight. I gripped the knife tightly, ready to defend myself if they tried to come inside. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The shadow eventually moved away, the footsteps retreating into the forest. I didn't relax. Instead, I stayed awake, straining to hear if they might come back. The forest remained eerily quiet.
No birds, no insects.
Just the occasional sigh of the wind. As dawn approached, the tension in my body began to ease. The pale light of morning filtered through the tent walls, and I finally allowed myself to exhale. I unzipped the tent cautiously, stepping out into the chilly air. The clearing looked the same as it had the evening before, but there was a faint unease to it now. I scanned the ground, looking for any signs of what might have happened. Sure enough, there were footprints in the dirt. They circled my tent, just as I'd thought. They weren't particularly large, but they were unmistakably human. My stomach turned as I realized how close they'd been. Whoever it was hadn't tried to harm me, but their presence felt like a violation. I didn't know their intentions, and that was what scared me the most. I decided to pack up and leave. The wilderness no longer felt welcoming. It felt threatening. As I broke down the tent and stuffed my gear into my pack, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching from the trees. The hike back to the trailhead was long and grueling, every sound making me jump. The forest that had seemed so serene now felt alive with unseen eyes. When I finally reached my car, relief washed over me. I loaded my gear quickly, eager to put distance between myself and that campsite. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, though the road behind me was empty. In the days that followed, I thought about what had happened. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it could have been another hiker, someone who didn't realize how much they'd scared me. But the truth was I didn't know, and that not knowing stayed with me, a nagging reminder of how vulnerable we are when we're alone in the wild. I haven't been back to that campsite since. I still go camping, but I'm more cautious now. I choose sites closer to established trails, where other people are likely to be nearby. And I always keep my guard up, knowing that the wilderness is beautiful, but it's not always kind. It's a lesson I'll never forget. The forest was quieter than I expected. I thought camping solo would be peaceful, maybe even meditative, but the silence felt heavy, almost unnatural. I set up my tent in a clearing about 5 miles from the trailhead. The place was perfect, or so I thought. Trees surrounded me in every direction, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the late afternoon sunlight into scattered patches of gold. A small creek ran nearby, the gentle burble of water the only sound besides my own movements. I tried to convince myself it was idyllic. I pitched my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and unpacked some snacks for dinner. The forest had been dry lately, so I decided against a campfire. The last thing I needed was to be responsible for starting a wildfire. Instead, I boiled some water on my little portable stove for instant noodles and sipped at a lukewarm can of beer I'd packed in. The simplicity of it was supposed to be the point, to get away from the noise of everyday life. But as the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched longer, I couldn't shake a sense of unease. The first thing I noticed was how the sounds around me seemed to vanish as the daylight faded. During the day, I'd heard birds, squirrels, and even the occasional rustling of what I assumed were deer moving through the underbrush. Now it was as if the forest had gone still. Even the creek seemed quieter, its gentle gurgle muffled by the encroaching night. I told myself this was normal. Predators hunt at night, and prey animals know to keep quiet. It was biology, not some sign of impending doom. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the silence. It was the way the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, the way my skin prickled like I was being watched. I scanned the trees, but the shadows were thick now, and my flashlight only pierced so far into the darkness. "Get it together?" I muttered under my breath, more to break the silence than anything else. I crawled into my tent around 9 p.m., though it felt much later. Without the hum of electronics or the glow of city lights, time seemed to stretch. I read for a while by the light of my headlamp, but the words on the page didn't hold my attention. I kept glancing toward the tent's zipper door, listening for sounds that weren't there. Eventually, I turned off the light and lay back, staring up at the tent's nylon ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily. At some point in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep, but my heart was racing, and I was immediately alert. For a moment, I stayed completely still, ears straining for any sound. The forest was still quiet, but there was something else. A faint crunching noise, like someone stepping on dry leaves. It was intermittent, faint enough that I couldn't pinpoint the direction. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a fox, but the sound didn't move away. It stayed in the same general area, close enough that I couldn't ignore it. I reached for the knife I'd brought with me. It wasn't much, just a small camping blade, but holding it made me feel slightly less vulnerable. My other hand found my flashlight. I debated for what felt like an eternity, heart pounding, before unzipping the tent just enough to peek out. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating a small section of the clearing. Trees, bushes, nothing else. The sound had stopped. I stayed like that for several minutes, scanning the area, but there was nothing. Eventually, I zipped the tent back up and tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. The next morning, I found tracks near my campsite. They were human, barefoot, no less, and they circled my tent. My stomach dropped when I saw them. They weren't there when I set up camp the day before. I was sure of it. Someone had been here during the night, close enough to touch my tent if they'd wanted to. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I'd never experienced before. I considered packing up and heading back to the trailhead, but it was early, and part of me didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was a prank, I thought, some other hiker messing around. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to move my campsite. I packed up everything and hiked another mile or two down the trail before finding another clearing. This one was less picturesque, but it felt more secluded. I spent the day trying to distract myself. I explored a bit, took some photos, and even tried fishing in the creek. By evening, I'd almost convinced myself the tracks were nothing to worry about. Almost. That night, the feeling returned. The sense of being watched. The silence. Around midnight, I heard the crunching again. This time, it was louder, closer. I stayed in the tent, clutching my knife, my flashlight turned off to avoid drawing attention. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and deliberate. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever it was might hear it. I wanted to scream, to tell them to go away, but fear kept me frozen. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. I waited, holding my breath, for what felt like hours before I dared to move. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The tracks were there again, circling my tent in the soft dirt. I scanned the area but saw no one. I couldn't stay another night. I packed up as quickly as I could and started back toward the trailhead. The hike out felt longer than the hike in. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. When I finally reached my car, I practically threw my gear into the trunk and locked the doors. Relief washed over me as I started the engine and pulled out onto the gravel road. I told myself I'd never camp alone again, but as I drove away, I couldn't help glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. Back at home, I tried to make sense of what happened. Maybe it was just another hiker, though the lack of shoes didn't make sense. Maybe it was someone messing with me, but the deliberate way the tracks circled my tent, the way the sounds stopped whenever I tried to investigate, it didn't feel like a joke. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never forget the way it felt to be hunted, to feel completely at someone else's mercy. Camping alone had seemed like a good idea at the time. Now I'm not so sure. I've always loved the outdoors, and camping has been a tradition for me for as long as I can remember. There's a particular sense of calm that only the wilderness can bring. The sound of rustling leaves, the occasional chirp of crickets, the way the air feels fresher away from the city. But the trip I took last year has made me think twice about camping alone ever again. It started as a spur-of-the-moment decision. I had a long weekend, and the forecast predicted clear skies. I packed my gear, a tent, sleeping bag, some freeze-dried meals, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and enough water for a couple of days. I'd chosen a less frequented trail in a national forest about 3 hours from my home. It wasn't completely off the map, but it was remote enough that I knew I wouldn't run into crowds. Just what I wanted. The drive up was uneventful. The road wound through dense woods, the kind where sunlight struggles to reach the forest floor. I arrived at the trailhead around noon, parked my car in the small gravel lot, and shouldered my pack. There was a sign-in sheet for hikers, which I filled out, noting my expected return date. Precaution, I thought, though I'd never had any issues before. The trail was beautiful, with towering pines on either side and the occasional clearing offering stunning views of the rolling hills in the distance. I hiked for about 4 hours before finding a spot that seemed perfect to set up camp. It was a small clearing near a creek, far enough from the trail to feel secluded but close enough that I wouldn't lose my bearings. I pitched my tent, gathered some wood for a small fire, and settled in for the evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest came alive with sounds. The gurgle of the creek, the hum of insects, and the occasional hoot of an owl created a symphony that was oddly comforting. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, ate while staring up at the stars, and felt a deep sense of peace. It's moments like these that make camping worthwhile. The first night passed without incident. I woke early, brewed some coffee on my portable stove, and decided to explore the area. I left most of my gear at the campsite, taking only a small day pack with some essentials. I followed the creek upstream, marveling at the way the sunlight danced on the water's surface. Occasionally, I'd spot animal tracks in the mud, deer, raccoons, and once what looked like bear tracks. They didn't seem fresh, so I wasn't too concerned. By mid-afternoon, I decided to head back to camp. I retraced my steps along the creek, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. The forest seemed quieter than it had been earlier, the usual background chatter of birds and insects noticeably absent. I shrugged it off as my imagination and pressed on. When I reached my campsite, my stomach dropped. My tent was slashed open, the fabric hanging in shreds. My belongings were scattered across the clearing, some of them missing entirely. My food bag, which I'd hung from a tree to keep away from animals, was gone. The rope dangled empty. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. This wasn't the work of animals. Someone had been here. My first thought was to check if anyone was still around. I scanned the area, my heart pounding, but saw no one. The ground near my camp was soft and I could make out footprints, boot prints, not paw prints. They led away from the clearing, disappearing into the woods. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I debated what to do. The sun was already starting to sink, and I was at least a 4-hour hike from the trailhead. Hiking back in the dark wasn't ideal, but staying didn't feel safe either. I decided to pack up what I could and head back toward my car. My sleeping bag was intact, and I still had my flashlight, a knife, and some water. Everything else was either damaged or missing. As I hurriedly packed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. I'd never felt so vulnerable. By the time I started down the trail, the sky was a deep orange, fading quickly to gray. I walked as fast as I could, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. The forest, which had felt so welcoming the day before, now seemed oppressive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. I told myself it was just animals, that I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But I couldn't shake the thought of those boot prints. About an hour into my hike, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. On the side of the trail, illuminated by my flashlight, was a makeshift arrangement of sticks. They were propped up against each other in a crude structure, almost like a small teepee. It hadn't been there on my way in. My pulse quickened. Who had put it there and why? I didn't linger to find out. I picked up my pace, practically jogging down the trail. The beam of my flashlight bounced with each step, casting erratic shadows that only added to my anxiety. My legs burned, but I didn't dare slow down. Then I heard it, a sound that sent a jolt of pure terror through me. Footsteps, not the random crunch of animals moving through the underbrush, but deliberate, measured steps. They were behind me, faint but unmistakable. I stopped, holding my breath, and the footsteps stopped too. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out everything else. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam illuminated trunks and branches, but no sign of anyone. "Hello!" I called out, my voice shaking. Silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I turned back and started walking again, faster this time. The footsteps resumed, keeping pace with me. Whoever it was, they were staying just out of sight. Panic set in and I broke into a run. My pack jostled against my back, and my flashlight wobbled in my hand, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. The trail seemed endless, each turn revealing nothing but more darkness. My breaths came in ragged gasps, and my legs felt like they might give out. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. I'd read somewhere that predators, human or otherwise, can sense fear. Well, they wouldn't have to sense it in me. It was radiating off me like a beacon. Finally, I saw it. The faint glimmer of moonlight reflecting off the metal of my car. I burst into the clearing, fumbling with my keys as I sprinted to the driver's side. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the door. I threw my pack into the passenger seat, jumped in, and locked the doors. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to catch my breath. The forest was silent again, as if nothing had happened. I half expected someone to step out of the trees, but no one did. After a few minutes, I started the car and drove away, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, I finally felt safe enough to let my guard down. I checked my phone, which I'd left in the car during the hike, and saw that I had no service. It wasn't until I was back home the next morning that I reported the incident to the park rangers. They took my statement and said they'd investigate, but I never heard back. Part of me wonders if I imagined the whole thing, but I know what I felt out there. Since then, I've stuck to more populated trails and always bring a friend along. The wilderness still calls to me, but the thought of being truly alone out there, it's not the same anymore. Something or someone took that peace from me, and I don't think I'll ever get it back. The crunch of gravel beneath my boots was oddly soothing as I walked the narrow trail, my heavy pack swaying slightly with each step. I was alone, deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, and surrounded by the silence of nature. It was exactly what I needed, a break from the noise and chaos of everyday life. Work had been relentless, and my personal life wasn't much better. This trip was supposed to be my reset button. Just me, my tent, and the forest for the next 3 days. The trail twisted and turned through dense thickets of pine and birch, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Occasionally, a bird would call out, its song piercing the stillness. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was late autumn, and the forest floor was a carpet of reds, yellows, and browns. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced as I moved. After several hours of hiking, I found a small clearing beside a stream. It was perfect. The water was clear and cold, and the ground was flat enough to pitch my tent. I set my pack down with a relieved sigh and began unpacking. First, the tent, a reliable, lightweight model I'd used on countless trips before. The process was second nature by now. Unroll, stake, and secure. Within minutes, it stood ready, a little patch of civilization in the wilderness. Next came gathering firewood. The forest was generous, offering plenty of dry branches and twigs. I stacked them neatly near the fire pit I'd fashioned from a ring of stones. Starting the fire was more challenging. The wind had picked up, making it difficult to coax a spark into a flame. But after some persistence, the kindling caught, and soon a small fire crackled cheerfully, its warmth chasing away the growing chill. Dinner was simple. A can of chili heated over the fire, paired with some crusty bread I'd packed. I ate slowly, savoring each bite as I listened to the babble of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves. The light faded quickly, and soon the forest was cloaked in darkness. The fire cast flickering shadows that seemed to stretch and twist among the trees. I wasn't scared, but I couldn't deny the primal unease that came with being alone in the dark. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, exhaustion had set in. The hike, the fresh air, and the sheer quiet had all conspired to make my eyelids heavy. I fell asleep to the sound of the stream, its gentle murmur lulling me into a dreamless slumber. I woke abruptly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. My breath puffed in the cold air, and the forest was utterly silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just silence. I lay still, listening. My heart thudded loudly in my chest, and I felt a prickle of unease. Something was off. I told myself it was nothing, just the natural quiet of the woods at night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The clearing looked the same as it had earlier, though the shadows seemed deeper and more menacing. I scanned the trees, my eyes straining to catch any movement, but there was nothing, just darkness and silence. I crawled back into the tent, pulling the sleeping bag up to my chin. Sleep didn't come easily after that. I lay awake for what felt like hours, every small sound, real or imagined, keeping me on edge. Eventually, fatigue won out and I drifted off. The next morning, the unease lingered, though I tried to shake it off. The sun was shining, and the forest looked far less intimidating in the daylight. I made myself a strong cup of instant coffee and some oatmeal, the warmth helping to steady my nerves. After packing a day pack with essentials, I decided to explore the area. Hiking always calmed me, and I hoped it would help me forget the odd feeling from the night before. The trail I chose was narrow and overgrown, winding through dense underbrush. As I walked, I noticed subtle signs that the forest was waking up. The chatter of squirrels, the distant call of a woodpecker, the rustle of leaves as a deer bolted at my approach. The sun filtered through the trees, creating patches of light that danced on the ground. For a while, I felt at peace. That changed when I stumbled upon something I couldn't explain. It was a tree, its trunk deeply scarred with parallel grooves that looked too deliberate to be natural. The marks were jagged and uneven, as though made by a tool or a claw. I knelt to examine them, running my fingers over the rough edges. The bark around the grooves was fresh, the wood beneath pale and exposed. Whatever had done this, it had been recent. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings. The forest seemed quieter again, the sounds of wildlife strangely absent. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a bear or some other animal, but the rational explanation didn't make me feel any better. I decided to head back to camp. The hike back felt longer than it should have. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me on edge. By the time I reached the clearing, my nerves were frayed. I busied myself with chores to distract from the growing unease. I gathered more firewood, boiled water for tea, and double-checked my gear. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and making the tent flap noisily. The fire struggled against the gusts, casting erratic shadows that seemed to leap and twist. I stayed up late, staring into the flames and clutching my flashlight like a talisman. Sleep felt impossible, but eventually, I crawled into my sleeping bag, too tired to stay awake any longer. I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were faint but unmistakable, crunching softly on the leaves outside the tent. My heart raced as I strained to hear more. The steps paused, then resumed, circling the tent slowly. I reached for the flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" I wanted to call out, but my throat felt tight. The words stuck. The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. Summoning every ounce of courage, I unzipped the tent and shone the light outside. The clearing was empty. The fire had died completely, leaving only a faint glow from the embers. I stepped out, the cold biting through my clothes. My breath fogged in the air as I scanned the perimeter, the flashlight beam sweeping over the trees. Nothing. No signs of anyone or anything. But then I saw them. Footprints in the dirt, just a few feet from the tent. They were human, bare, and larger than mine. The prints led away from the clearing, disappearing into the woods. My stomach churned. Someone had been here watching me. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, sitting by the relit fire with my knife in hand. Every sound set my nerves on edge, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. When dawn finally broke, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The first light of day chased away some of the fear, but I knew I couldn't stay. I packed up camp in record time, my movements hurried and clumsy. I needed to get out of there. The hike back to the trailhead was grueling. Every step felt like a struggle, my pack heavier than I remembered. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me, but the trail remained empty. The woods were silent again, the only sounds my labored breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. When I finally reached my car, I tossed my pack into the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the roar of the motor breaking the oppressive silence. I drove away without looking back, the tension in my chest easing only when the forest was far behind me. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The memory of those footsteps, those bare prints in the dirt, haunted me. I told myself it could have been a harmless explanation, another camper maybe or someone passing through, but deep down I knew better. Whoever or whatever had been out there with me wasn't harmless. And the scariest part? I'd probably never know what they wanted or why they'd been watching me. I haven't been camping since. The air smelled crisp and slightly earthy, the way it always does deep in the woods. I was miles away from the nearest road, and that was exactly what I wanted: isolation. I had planned this trip for months. No cell service, no traffic noise, just me, my gear, and nature. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning. My backpack was heavier than I'd like, but I'd packed carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, enough food for 3 days, water filtration gear, and a first aid kit. The essentials. It was a 2-day hike to the spot I'd picked out, a secluded patch near a small, unnamed lake. The first day was uneventful. The trail twisted and climbed through dense forest, the canopy overhead blocking out most of the sunlight. Occasionally, I'd stop to catch my breath or take a sip of water. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the dirt path and the occasional bird call. It felt good to be out there, away from everything. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing with just enough room to pitch my tent. I set up camp quickly, collected some firewood, and had a simple dinner of instant noodles and a protein bar. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest around me came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. I sat by the fire for a while, staring into the flames, until the chill drove me into my tent. The second day was more challenging. The trail became steeper and less defined, and I had to rely on my map and compass to stay on course. By midday, I was drenched in sweat and my legs ached, but I was making progress. The thought of reaching the lake kept me going. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed the forest seemed different, quieter. The usual background hum of insects and birds was gone. I told myself it was probably just my imagination, or maybe I was so focused on the hike that I hadn't noticed the sounds fading. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was low in the sky. The water was calm and dark, reflecting the trees that lined its edge. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about the stillness. I set up my tent a few yards from the shore and tried to ignore the unease that had settled in my chest. After dinner, I sat by the water, hoping the peaceful setting would calm my nerves. Didn't. The forest felt too quiet, too still. I tried to convince myself that I was just spooking myself, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tight. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it, a faint rustling outside the tent. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a deer, but the rustling didn't sound random. It was slow, deliberate, like someone or something was moving around the campsite. I lay there, frozen, listening. The sound moved closer, then stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. Minutes passed. Finally, I mustered the courage to unzip the tent just a tiny bit and peek out. The moonlight illuminated the clearing, but I didn't see anything unusual. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, clutching my knife and flashlight, jumping at every little sound. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted but relieved to see the sun. I packed up quickly, eager to leave the lake behind. The hike back started off uneventfully. I kept telling myself I'd overreacted, that the noises had just been an animal. But as the day went on, that uneasy feeling returned. Every so often, I thought I heard something behind me, a twig snapping, leaves rustling. Whenever I stopped to look, the forest was empty. By late afternoon, I was almost running. The trail was harder to follow on the way back, and I had to keep checking my map. The sun was starting to set, and I knew I needed to find a place to camp soon. I stumbled across a small clearing and decided it would have to do. I set up my tent as quickly as I could, barely stopping to eat before crawling inside. I zipped it up tight and lay there, listening. first, there was nothing. Then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it again, rustling, faint but deliberate. My heart was racing. I gripped my knife and flashlight, ready for, I didn't know what. The sound moved closer, then stopped. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't dare move. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I drifted off to sleep. I woke up at first light and packed up as quickly as I could. I didn't bother eating. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the trailhead was a blur. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost dizzying. I threw my gear in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. As I started the engine and pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest loomed behind me, dark and impenetrable. I never figured out what had been out there, and maybe that's for the best. All I know is that I've never gone camping alone again. It was a Friday afternoon when I decided to head out into the woods for some solitude. Work had been eating me alive, and I couldn't take another moment staring at my computer screen or hearing the hum of the office lights. I needed to breathe, really breathe, and clear my head. I packed up my gear: a tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, plenty of water, some food, a flashlight, and my trusty knife. I always liked to be prepared, but I didn't overdo it. This wasn't my first solo camping trip, and I'd been to this area before. A dense stretch of forest about an hour's drive from my home. The trailhead was nearly empty when I arrived, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. The fewer people, the better. I slung my backpack over my shoulders, adjusted the straps, and set off down the path. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall pines, casting long shadows across the dirt trail. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, and every step I took seemed to settle the tension in my chest. I hiked for about 2 hours before I found a spot that felt right. It was a small clearing surrounded by trees, with just enough room for my tent. A creek ran nearby, its soft gurgling sound adding to the sense of peace. I set up camp methodically, pitching my tent on a flat patch of ground, gathering some rocks to build a small fire ring, and unpacking my gear. By the time I was done, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. After lighting a small fire, I cooked a simple meal, just some noodles and a can of beans. It wasn't gourmet, but it was warm and filling. I sat by the fire, eating slowly and staring into the flames as the light faded around me. The forest came alive with sounds: the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was calming in a way that only nature could be. When the fire died down to embers, I crawled into my tent and zipped myself into my sleeping bag. The ground was hard beneath me, but I didn't mind. I closed my eyes and let the sounds of the forest lull me to sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. I lay there in the darkness, listening. The forest was quieter than before. The crickets had stopped chirping, and the only sound I could hear was the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I reached for my flashlight, turning it on and shining it around the inside of the tent. Everything seemed normal. Still, there was a feeling I couldn't shake, a sense that something was off. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The air was cold, and the sky was clear, the stars shining brighter than I'd ever seen them. My fire pit was a faint glow of orange, the last remnants of the fire smoldering. I shone my flashlight around the clearing, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just shadows and the silhouettes of branches swaying gently. But as I turned to head back into the tent, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement in the trees. I froze, holding my breath, and pointed my flashlight in the direction I'd seen it. There was nothing there, just darkness and trees. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. This was the woods, after all. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. I climbed back into the tent and zipped it up, lying awake for what felt like hours, listening. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds singing. The uneasiness of the night before felt like a distant memory, something I could chalk up to my imagination and the natural eeriness of being alone in the woods. I made myself some coffee on my little stove and ate a granola bar for breakfast. Then I packed a small day pack with water, snacks, and my knife and set out to explore the area. I followed the creek upstream for a while, enjoying the way the sunlight danced on the water. The forest was beautiful, a mix of towering pines and smaller, leafy trees. I came across a few animal tracks in the mud. Deer, maybe, or something smaller. I'm not an expert, but I like trying to guess. I lost track of time as I wandered, the sound of the creek and the crunch of leaves underfoot keeping me company. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was high in the sky. I spent the afternoon reading a book I'd brought, lounging in the shade of a tree. It was exactly the kind of break I'd needed. As the sun began to set, I built another fire and cooked dinner. The uneasiness I'd felt the night before was completely gone. I felt relaxed, at peace. That night, though, the feeling returned. I woke up again in the middle of the night, the same as before. The forest was silent, and I had that same sense that something was off. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the trees. First, everything seemed normal, but then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The rocks around my fire pit had been moved. They were scattered, as if someone or something had kicked them aside. The faint glow of the embers was gone, completely snuffed out. My first thought was an animal, but the rocks were heavy, too heavy for a small animal to move. And why would an animal bother with the fire pit? I shone my flashlight around the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I backed slowly into the tent, zipping it up and clutching my knife. I sat there in the dark, listening, every nerve in my body on edge. Eventually, the sounds of the forest returned, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves. But I didn't sleep. I sat there, wide awake, until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. As soon as it was light enough to see, I packed up my gear. I didn't want to stick around to find out what had been messing with my camp. The thought of hiking back to the trailhead alone made my stomach churn, but staying felt worse. I slung my pack over my shoulders and set off down the trail, moving as quickly as I could without breaking into a run. The forest felt different in the daylight, less menacing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often, I'd stop and listen, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on the dirt. I kept going, my eyes scanning the trees, my hand resting on the knife at my belt. When I finally reached the trailhead, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. My car was parked exactly where I'd left it, and there was no sign of anyone else around. I threw my pack into the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone emerge from the trees. I never did figure out what happened that night. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was my imagination. Or maybe it was someone else. I don't know. What I do know is that I haven't been camping alone since. The woods, as beautiful as they are, no longer feel like a place of peace. They feel like a place where I don't belong. The air was cold, sharper than I expected for late spring. The fire crackled in front of me, a weak source of warmth as the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the campsite. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just me and the wilderness, a break from the monotony of city life. I'd packed my old hiking pack with all the essentials: a small tent, a sleeping bag, a lightweight stove, a first aid kit, and enough food to last a couple of days. I'd planned for peace, solitude, and maybe a little self-reflection. The trail I chose wasn't particularly remote. It was about an hour's drive from the nearest town, and the path was marked well enough that even a novice hiker could navigate it. But the deeper I went, the fewer signs of human presence I saw. No footprints in the dirt except my own. No distant chatter or laughter from other campers. Just the sounds of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. By late afternoon, I'd found what seemed like the perfect spot. A small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a stream not too far away. I pitched my tent on a patch of flat ground, gathered some dry wood, and set up my little camp. The rhythm of it all felt comforting, the kind of work that quiets the mind. As the evening settled in, I cooked a simple meal, just a packet of dehydrated chili and some crackers. It wasn't gourmet, but it was filling, and the warmth of it spread through my body as I ate. The fire's glow painted the trees around me in shades of orange and gold, and for the first time in a long while, I felt completely at ease. The first sign that something was off came around dusk. I was sitting by the fire, poking at the embers with a stick, when I noticed the woods had gone silent. The birds had stopped calling. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. At first, I brushed it off as one of those things you don't really notice until you're alone in the wilderness. But the silence pressed down on me, heavy and unnatural. I tried to shake the feeling. Maybe there was a predator nearby, I thought. A bear or a mountain lion. Animals tend to go quiet when something dangerous is in the area. Still, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few minutes, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. I wrapped myself in my jacket and retreated into my tent, zipping it up tight. Inside, the thin walls felt like both a shield and a vulnerability. I could still hear the occasional pop of the fire outside. But beyond that, nothing. No crickets, no rustling leaves. Just an eerie, oppressive quiet. I woke sometime in the middle of the night, unsure of what had roused me. My watch said it was just past 2 a.m. The fire had burned down to a faint glow, and the air inside the tent was bitterly cold. As I lay there, trying to will myself back to sleep, I heard it. A faint sound, distant but distinct. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. A low, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps in the underbrush. My breath caught in my throat. I strained my ears, hoping it was just my imagination, but the sound continued. Slowly, methodically, it grew louder, closer. I've always considered myself a rational person. I don't scare easily, and I've spent enough time in the outdoors to know the difference between natural and unnatural sounds. This wasn't natural. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay still, to not make a sound. But my mind raced with possibilities. Who or what was out there, and why? The footsteps stopped just beyond the edge of the campsite. I could barely breathe, my pulse hammering in my ears. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a new sound, a soft, deliberate tapping. It came from the direction of the stream, rhythmic and steady, like someone striking a rock against a tree. I tried to think logically. Maybe it was another camper, lost and trying to signal for help. But why approach so silently? Why not call out? And why would they be out here in the middle of the night? I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, every muscle tensed. Minutes passed, then hours. The tapping eventually stopped, but I didn't dare move. I didn't sleep. The faint light of dawn finally began to seep through the tent walls, and with it came the courage to unzip the flap and peer outside. The campsite looked the same as I'd left it, but something felt different. The air was heavy, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I stepped out, my boots crunching on the frosty ground, and scanned the area. Nothing seemed out of place until I approached the stream. There, on the bank, was a pile of rocks stacked in a strange, deliberate formation. 5 or 6 stones balanced on top of one another, with smaller pebbles arranged in a circle around them. It wasn't natural. Someone had done this. Recently, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I quickly gathered my things and packed up camp. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that the footsteps and the tapping could be explained away. But deep down, I knew better. The hike back to the trailhead felt interminable. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But the trail remained empty. When I finally reached my car, I tossed my pack into the trunk and locked the doors as quickly as I could. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the dirt road without looking back. It wasn't until I was miles away, back in the safety of civilization, that I allowed myself to breathe. Even now, days later, I can't shake the memory of that night. The sound of footsteps, the tapping, the strange rock formation by the stream. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just another camper or some strange coincidence. But the unease lingers, a weight in the back of my mind. I've always loved the wilderness. This is where I've felt most alive, most connected to the world around me. But after that night, I'm not so sure anymore. Something out there reminded me that the woods aren't just a place of beauty and solitude. They're also vast, untamed, and unknowable. And sometimes they're not ours to understand. I could feel the cool evening air pressing against my skin as I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the clearing. The sun was dipping below the treeline, casting long, jagged shadows across the forest floor. I had been looking forward to this solo camping trip for months, an escape from the relentless noise of life, the chance to prove to myself that I could manage on my own out here. The clearing was small, surrounded by towering pine trees, their needles rustling softly in the breeze. I had picked this spot carefully, studying maps and satellite images for weeks. It was deep in the wilderness, miles from the nearest trailhead, the perfect place to unplug and just be. I busied myself setting up for the night. My tent was already pitched on the flattest piece of ground I could find, a compact little dome that I triple-checked for any rips or leaks before heading out. I unrolled my sleeping bag inside, tucking it neatly on top of the sleeping pad to keep the cold ground at bay. My small camping stove hissed softly as I boiled water for a freeze-dried meal. Chicken and rice, not exactly gourmet, but filling enough. As I stirred the food pouch, I noticed how quiet the forest had become. The usual sounds of chirping birds and buzzing insects had faded, leaving only the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I tried not to let it unsettle me. This was normal, I told myself, nature's rhythm. Still, there was something about the silence that felt heavier than it should have, like the forest was holding its breath. After dinner, I built a small fire, feeding it with dry branches and twigs until it crackled and spat warm orange light into the encroaching darkness. Sitting by the fire, I let myself relax. The flickering flames were hypnotic, and the heat on my face was comforting against the cool night air. I sipped on a tin cup of instant coffee and stared into the woods, where shadows danced and shifted but never quite formed into anything solid. It was around that time that I first noticed it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible over the crackling fire. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. A soft crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. I strained my ears, peering into the darkness beyond the firelight. "It's probably just a deer," I muttered under my breath, though my voice sounded small and uncertain. I had read about how deer and other animals often wandered close to campsites, curious but wary. I told myself there was no reason to be alarmed. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The sound stopped. I waited, my body tense, listening for any hint of movement. The forest had gone silent again, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if every living thing had frozen in place. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the fire, and eventually, the unease began to fade. By the time I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, the fire had died down to glowing embers. I lay on my back, the thin fabric of the tent the only thing separating me from the vast, dark woods. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves outside, but nothing out of the ordinary. It took a while, but eventually, I drifted off to sleep. I woke abruptly sometime in the middle of the night. My heart was racing, though I couldn't immediately remember why. The tent was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the moon filtering through the fabric. I held my breath, straining to hear what might have woken me. First, there was nothing, just the faint rustle of the wind in the trees. Then I heard it again, that same rhythmic crunching, closer this time. My mouth went dry. I lay perfectly still, listening as the sound grew louder. It wasn't constant, like an animal foraging. It was deliberate. Step, pause, step, pause. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving slowly, methodically. My mind raced through possibilities. A hiker? Unlikely, given how remote this area was. An animal? Maybe, but it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever encountered. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I stared at the ceiling, too afraid to move. The fabric of the tent shifted slightly, as if something had brushed against it. I bit down on my lip to keep from making a sound. The seconds stretched into minutes, and still I didn't dare move. Eventually, the footsteps began again, retreating this time, growing fainter until they disappeared altogether. I lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to sleep. When the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent and step outside. The clearing looked the same as it had the evening before, calm and undisturbed. But as I looked around, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Near the edge of the clearing, where the forest began to thicken, I saw a single footprint pressed into the soft earth. It was unmistakably human, larger than my own boot print and fresh enough that the edges hadn't yet crumbled. My stomach churned as I stared at the print. Someone had been here watching me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an old print distorted by the elements. But no, it was too fresh, too clear. Whoever it was had been there that night. I packed up my camp in record time, my hands shaking as I stuffed my gear into my backpack. The sense of isolation that had seemed so appealing before now felt suffocating. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge as I hurried to get everything ready. The hike back to the trailhead was grueling. I'd planned to stay another night, but there was no way I could stay out here after what had happened. My head was on a constant swivel, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The forest that had seemed so peaceful before now felt hostile, the towering trees like silent sentinels watching my every move. I reached the trailhead by late afternoon, my legs aching and my throat dry from the effort. As I loaded my gear into the car, I took one last look back at the forest. It stood there, silent and unyielding, giving nothing away. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow along the road seemed to shift. Every dark shape just beyond the headlights felt like it could be someone standing there, waiting. By the time I reached the highway, the tension had started to ease, but the unease lingered like a shadow at the back of my mind. That night, I slept in my own bed, the familiar sounds of the city lulling me into a restless sleep. But even in the safety of my apartment, I couldn't shake the image of that footprint, stark and solitary in the dirt. It was a reminder that no matter how far you go to escape, you're never truly alone. And sometimes, the scariest thing out there isn't the wilderness itself. It's the other people who wander into it. I never thought a simple camping trip could turn into something so terrifying. It started off as a plan to escape the monotony of my routine. A weekend in the woods to clear my head and enjoy some solitude. I had found a spot online, a remote area near a lake, surrounded by tall pines and a scattering of old trails. It was perfect, or so I thought. I packed everything meticulously. My tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, canned food, plenty of water, and my trusty headlamp. I even threw in a paperback book to read by the fire. I wanted this trip to be as relaxing as possible. Early Saturday morning, I loaded everything into my car and drove 3 hours to reach the trailhead. The drive was uneventful, just long stretches of highway that eventually gave way to winding forest roads. When I arrived, the parking area was completely empty. It wasn't surprising considering how out of the way this place was. That's what drew me to it in the first place. I grabbed my gear, locked the car, and set off down the trail. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. It felt good to be away from the noise of the city. The hike to the lake took about 2 hours. The trail was narrow and a bit overgrown in places, but nothing I couldn't handle. When I finally reached the lake, I was struck by how serene it was. The water was still, reflecting the sky like a mirror, and the surrounding trees formed a perfect frame. There wasn't a single sign of another human being. It was exactly what I had hoped for. I set up camp near the water's edge, choosing a flat patch of ground with a good view of the lake. The tent went up without a hitch, and I gathered some dry wood for a fire later. By the time everything was ready, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I sat by the fire, ate a simple meal of canned soup, and stared into the flames. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. As darkness settled in, the forest came alive with sounds. Crickets chirped, and frogs croaked from the lake. Occasionally, I'd hear the rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig, but I brushed it off as small animals going about their night. Still, there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, a sense that I wasn't entirely alone. I tried to shake it off, blaming it on my imagination. I crawled into my tent around 10 p.m., zipping it up tightly. The fire outside had died down to glowing embers, and the moon cast a faint light over the campsite. Lying in my sleeping bag, I listened to the sounds of the forest. It took a while, but eventually, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. I lay still, straining my ears. The usual night sounds were there, but something was off. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They stopped just outside my tent. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. Whoever or whatever it was, they were standing right there. Then I heard a soft scraping sound, like fingers brushing against the fabric of the tent. My stomach twisted in fear. I didn't dare move. I reached slowly for the knife I kept in my bag, gripping it tightly. The scraping stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, without warning, the footsteps started again, moving away this time. I waited until the sound faded completely before I let out a shaky breath. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay there, clutching the knife, jumping at every little sound. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief. The sunlight made everything seem less threatening. I unzipped the tent cautiously and stepped outside. The campsite looked undisturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I debated whether to pack up and leave, but I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe it had been an animal after all. I spent the day exploring the area, sticking close to the lake. The daylight helped calm my nerves, and by evening, I was feeling more at ease. I built another fire, cooked dinner, and even read a few chapters of my book. I told myself I'd overreacted the night before, but that night it happened again. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, this time louder and more erratic. They circled the tent, stopping and starting. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I gripped the knife again, trying to stay calm. Then, something new. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl. It wasn't an animal. Couldn't be. I couldn't take it anymore. I shouted, "Who's there?" My voice sounded shaky and weak. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, without warning, something slammed against the side of the tent, hard enough to knock me back. I screamed, slashing wildly with the knife. Whatever it was let out a startled yelp and retreated. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my flashlight and bolted out of the tent. The campsite was empty, but I didn't care. I shoved everything into my backpack, leaving the tent behind, and started running back toward the trailhead. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I stumbled through the dark, but I didn't stop. The hike back was a blur. I tripped several times, scraping my hands and knees, but I kept going. Every so often, I'd hear something in the distance, like branches snapping, and it spurred me to move faster. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted and covered in dirt. I threw my gear into the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly it took me a few tries to get the key into the ignition. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing me. But the road behind me was empty. I didn't stop driving until I was back in my apartment, safe behind locked doors. Only then did I allow myself to break down. To this day, I don't know what happened out there. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just an animal or some prankster trying to scare me. But deep down, I know it wasn't that simple. Something or someone was out there and they wanted me gone. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a break from the noise of life, a chance to reconnect with nature and let my mind unwind. I had planned everything meticulously. My gear was all packed. A lightweight tent, a sturdy sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, and a first aid kit. I had chosen a remote spot deep in the national forest, a place I'd found on a hiking forum. It wasn't marked on any official map, but according to the few people who'd been there, it was stunning. A clearing by a small river, surrounded by dense trees and far from the reach of cell service or crowds. The drive took most of the morning. I left the paved roads behind and followed a dirt track that grew narrower with each mile. Eventually, I parked my car in a small pull-off area and started hiking. The trail wasn't well-trodden, but it was clear enough to follow. I had my GPS and a paper map just in case. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the path and the occasional call of a bird. It felt like I was stepping into another world. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was high in the sky. The spot was even more beautiful than I'd imagined. The river was clear and fast-moving, its banks lined with smooth stones and moss-covered logs. The clearing itself was flat and grassy, with just enough space to pitch my tent. Tall trees formed a natural wall around the area, their branches arching overhead like a cathedral roof. I set up camp quickly, eager to make the most of the day. After unpacking, I decided to explore the area. I followed the river upstream for a while, climbing over rocks and ducking under low-hanging branches. I found a small waterfall about a mile away, its water tumbling into a deep pool. The sight was mesmerizing, and I sat there for a long time, letting the sound of the water drown out everything else. Eventually, hunger pulled me back to camp. I cooked a simple meal on my portable stove and ate by the fire as the sky turned from blue to gold to deep indigo. That first night was peaceful. The air was cool but not cold, and the sound of the river lulled me to sleep. I woke up at dawn, feeling refreshed and eager to explore more. I spent the day hiking further into the forest, taking photos of wildflowers and animal tracks. I saw deer and a red fox, and once I caught a glimpse of something large and dark moving through the trees. Maybe a bear, though it was too far away to be sure. It didn't bother me. I had bear spray and knew how to store my food properly. By the time I returned to camp that evening, I was tired but content. I made another fire and cooked dinner, then sat staring into the flames as the stars came out. It was so quiet that every sound seemed amplified. The crackle of the fire, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional splash of a fish in the river. I felt completely alone in the best possible way. It wasn't until the second night that I started to feel uneasy. I woke up sometime after midnight to a sound outside my tent. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the more I listened, the less certain I became. The sound was faint, a soft crunching like footsteps on dry leaves. It came from the direction of the river, paused, then moved closer. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The steps stopped just outside my tent. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, very faintly, I heard what sounded like breathing. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My hand groped for the can of bear spray I kept by my sleeping bag. I gripped it tightly, my finger on the trigger. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, then stopped. I heard the crunch of footsteps again, moving away this time, fading into the distance. I lay there, rigid, until the first light of dawn filtered through the fabric of my tent. Only then did I unzip the flap and step outside. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before. There were no tracks, no signs that anyone or anything had been there. I tried to tell myself it had been an animal, maybe a curious deer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had sounded human. I spent the day close to camp, gathering firewood and reading by the river. I told myself I was just being cautious, but the truth was I didn't want to wander too far. The forest, which had seemed so inviting before, now felt oppressive. The trees were too tall, their shadows too dark. Every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. That night, I built the fire bigger than before, its light and heat a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. I stayed up as long as I could, staring into the flames, listening for any sound that didn't belong. When I finally crawled into my tent, I kept the bear spray in one hand and my flashlight in the other. I woke to the sound of snapping twigs. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone was out there. The steps were deliberate, slow but heavy. They circled the clearing, coming closer, then moving away. I turned on my flashlight and shone it through the thin fabric of the tent, but it revealed nothing. My heart was racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but fear kept me silent. The steps stopped again, this time right outside the tent. I could see the shadow of something through the fabric, tall, human-shaped. My grip tightened on the bear spray. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. After what felt like hours, the shadow moved away. The footsteps receded into the forest, and silence returned. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as it was light enough to see, I packed up my camp. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was probably just another camper who hadn't realized how close they were to my site. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was had been watching me, testing me. The hike back to my car felt endless. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I was being followed, but I never saw anyone. When I finally reached the parking area, my car was the only one there. I threw my gear into the trunk and locked the doors as soon as I was inside. I didn't relax until I was back on the main road, miles away from the forest. Even now, weeks later, I can't explain what happened. I've gone over it again and again, trying to make sense of it, but I always come up empty. All I know is that I've lost my taste for solitude. The wilderness, once a place of peace and wonder, now feels like a place I'm not meant to be. I still go hiking, but I stick to busy trails, where the sounds of other people remind me I'm not alone. The memory of those footsteps, of the shadow outside my tent, lingers at the edges of my mind, a reminder that some questions are better left unanswered. It started as a plan to disconnect for a weekend. I'd been feeling drained. Work deadlines, constant notifications, the endless noise of city life, and the idea of getting away sounded perfect. I chose a secluded camping spot up in the mountains, far from any crowds. It was late autumn, and the crisp air was already creeping in, but that only made the idea more appealing. The thought of being surrounded by golden leaves and the earthy smell of the forest felt like a remedy for everything weighing me down. I packed light but made sure to bring the essentials. A small tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold temperatures, a portable stove, some dehydrated meals, and a few other basics. I also had a map, a compass, and a fully charged phone with an external battery. I wasn't planning to rely on GPS, though. Part of the appeal was navigating the old-fashioned way. I wanted to feel capable and self-reliant, to remind myself I could still do something without technology holding my hand. The drive to the trailhead took a few hours. The last stretch of the road was unpaved and bumpy, winding steeply up into the mountains. By the time I parked, the sun was already dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dense forest. The air was cooler here, and the quiet was almost unnerving. No hum of traffic, no chatter of people, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. I slung my pack over my shoulders and started hiking. The trail was well marked at first, weaving through tall pines and patches of birch trees. The leaves crunched underfoot, and the smell of damp earth filled my nose. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd been craving. After about an hour, the trail narrowed and became less defined. According to the map, my destination was a small clearing near a creek about 3 miles in. It wasn't an official campsite, which meant I'd likely have it all to myself. By the time I reached the clearing, dusk had settled in. The spot was perfect, a flat patch of ground surrounded by trees, with the soft murmur of the creek just beyond. I set up my tent quickly, using the fading light to my advantage. By the time I was done, the forest was cloaked in darkness. The only light came from the small lantern I'd brought and the faint glow of the moon filtering through the branches. I made a simple dinner, heating up some soup on the portable stove, and sat on a log to eat. The silence was deeper now, the kind that feels almost alive. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves seemed amplified. It wasn't unsettling, though not yet. It just felt wild, like the forest was reminding me it was its own world, and I was merely a visitor. After dinner, I decided to call it an early night. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and turned off the lantern. The darkness was absolute. I could hear the creek gurgling softly, a soothing sound that lulled me towards sleep. For a while, everything was calm, But then, something woke me. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. A sound? A movement? I lay still, my heart thudding in my chest, straining to hear anything beyond the gentle noise of the creek. And then I caught it. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was distant, barely audible, but it was there. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal. A deer, a raccoon, something harmless. The forest was full of life after all. I tried to push the sound out of my mind and go back to sleep, but my body wouldn't relax. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, every nerve on edge, listening for the crunching to return. Didn't. The next morning, I woke early, the pale light of dawn filtering through the tent. Everything seemed normal again.
I convince a myself i de overreacta.
I made coffee, packed up my gear, and decided to explore the area. The forest was beautiful in the morning light, with the sun casting golden rays through the trees. I followed the creek upstream, enjoying the solitude and the crisp air. By midday, I was several miles from my campsite. I hadn't seen another soul, which wasn't surprising given how remote the area was. I stopped to eat a snack and take in the scenery. The creek widened here, and the water was so clear I could see fish darting between the rocks. It was exactly the kind of peaceful moment I'd hoped for. But as I started to head back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was subtle at first, a sense of being watched. I'd glance over my shoulder and see nothing but trees. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling grew stronger the closer I got to my campsite. When I arrived, the clearing looked the same as I'd left it. My tent was still standing, my gear untouched, but there was something new. A small pile of rocks near the edge of the clearing, stacked carefully, deliberately. It hadn't been there before. I froze, staring at the pile. Could have been nothing. Maybe another hiker had passed through and left it as a marker or some kind of harmless ritual. But it didn't feel harmless. It felt intrusive, like someone had been here in my space while I was gone. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the unease. I told myself I was overthinking it, letting my mind play tricks on me. But as night fell, the forest seemed different. The shadows were deeper, the silence heavier. I built a small fire, more for comfort than warmth, and sat close to it as I ate dinner. The light from the flames danced on the trees, casting flickering shapes that made me jump more than once. When it was time to sleep, I hesitated. The tent felt too exposed, too vulnerable, but I didn't have another option. I climbed in, zipped it shut, and lay there in the dark, every muscle tense. The footsteps came again. This time they were closer, more distinct. Slow, deliberate, they circled the clearing, pausing every few steps. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever, or whatever, was out there would hear it. I didn't move, didn't breathe, straining to hear more. And then they stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I lay there for what felt like hours, waiting for the footsteps to return. But they didn't. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke, the clearing was empty. No footprints, no sign anyone had been there. But the pile of rocks was gone. I decided then and there to cut the trip short. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The hike back to the trailhead felt longer than it should have. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, though I never saw anyone. When I finally reached my car, I tossed my pack in the back, locked the doors, and drove away without looking back. The sense of relief was overwhelming, but it was tinged with something else. A lingering unease, a question I couldn't answer. Who had been out there with me? Even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about it. About the footsteps, the pile of rocks, the way the forest had felt so alive, so aware. I'd gone looking for solitude, for peace. Instead, I found a reminder that the world is bigger, wilder, and stranger than I'd ever imagined. I've always loved the solitude of camping. Being out in the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but trees and the quiet hum of nature, was my escape from the noise of everyday life. That's why I planned a solo trip to a national forest I had been meaning to visit for years. It was supposed to be peaceful, rejuvenating, an opportunity to disconnect. But it turned into something I'll never forget for entirely different reasons. I drove out early on a Friday morning, my car packed with all the essentials. A tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a first aid kit, a map, and some tools. The forest was about a 3-hour drive from my house. As I got closer, the paved roads turned into dirt trails, and the cell signal on my phone began to flicker before disappearing altogether. I didn't mind. That was the whole point, after all. The trailhead parking lot was empty when I arrived, which I found oddly comforting. I checked the map one last time, strapped on my backpack, and started hiking. The trail was narrow but well-marked, winding through dense trees that towered above like ancient sentinels. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint smell of pine and damp earth. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the trail and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was perfect. After about 4 hours of hiking, I found a clearing by a small stream. It seemed like an ideal spot to set up camp. The ground was flat, the stream would provide water if needed, and the trees offered some cover. I pitched my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and set up a small fire pit with rocks I gathered from the streambed. By the time everything was ready, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, ate, and then sat back to enjoy the quiet. As darkness settled in, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. I felt at peace, completely removed from the worries of my regular life. But that first night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. At first, I told myself it was just the wind or an animal, a raccoon or maybe a deer. But the sound wasn't random. It was deliberate, like footsteps, slow and methodical, circling my campsite. I lay there, holding my breath, listening intently. I didn't dare unzip the tent to look. My heart was pounding in my chest, but eventually, the sound stopped, and I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Maybe the forest was just noisier than I expected. I eventually drifted off to sleep, but it was restless. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and looked around. There were no signs of anything unusual, no footprints, no disturbed ground. The fire pit was exactly as I had left it. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my nerves. I wasn't used to being this isolated, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. I spent the day exploring the area, hiking along the stream and taking in the scenery. The forest was beautiful, almost untouched. I didn't see another soul the entire day, which suited me just fine. By the time I returned to my campsite, I was tired but satisfied. I cooked dinner, watched the stars for a while, and then crawled into my tent, ready for a good night's sleep. But that night, the sounds returned. This time, they were louder. I could hear the crunch of leaves and the snap of twigs. It was unmistakable. Something or someone was out there. I sat up, clutching the small camping knife I kept by my side. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear, a stray dog, or worse, another person. I decided to call out. "Hello!" My voice sounded weak even to me. The sounds stopped immediately. The silence that followed was deafening. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, but nothing happened. After what felt like hours, I lay back down, knife still in hand, and stared at the roof of my tent until exhaustion finally claimed me. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. About 10 feet from my tent, in the soft dirt near the stream, were footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I had been wearing hiking boots, and these were smaller, barefoot. My mind reeled. Who would be out here barefoot in the middle of nowhere? I debated packing up and leaving right then and there, but a stubborn part of me didn't want to give in to fear. This was my trip, my escape, and I wasn't going to let some creepy footprints ruin it. I convinced myself it was probably just a local, someone who lived nearby and wandered through the woods. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. That day, I stayed closer to camp. I gathered firewood, read a book I had brought, and tried to enjoy the solitude. But I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. By the time night fell, I was on edge. I built a larger fire that night, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. As I sat by the flames, I thought I saw movement in the shadows beyond the firelight. My eyes played tricks on me, turning every shifting shadow into a potential threat. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I stood up, my knife in one hand and a flashlight in the other. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice stronger this time. Silence. I shone the flashlight into the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I decided I had had enough. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my eyes darting to the trees every few seconds. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The forest that had seemed so inviting now felt menacing. The hike back to the trailhead was nerve-wracking. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, set my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I never saw anyone. When I finally reached my car, I threw my backpack into the trunk and got in, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was safe, but as I drove down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible, was a figure. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but they were watching me. I pressed the gas pedal harder, not stopping until I was miles away. I still don't know who or what was out there with me. I've thought about it a lot since that trip, replaying every detail in my mind. Was it just a coincidence? A local passing through? Or was someone deliberately trying to scare me? I'll never know. But one thing is certain. I haven't been camping alone since.